Flossenbürg was never meant to be remembered. Hidden deep in the forests of northern Bavaria, far from Germany's great cities, it rose in silence, without grand gates, without infamy, without witnesses. Just stone, cold air, and a single purpose: work them, break them, replace them. When the camp opened in 1938, it was not built as a place of spectacle or mass execution. It was built as a machine, a quarry camp where human beings were converted into granite, weapons parts, and exhaustion. Prisoners were not sent here to be corrected or even killed quickly. They were sent here to be used until nothing remained. Each day began before dawn. Men marched uphill to the quarries, breath slicing through dust-filled air. Granite crushed fingers, split skin, and shattered spines. Guards counted output, not lives. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could no longer stand were discarded. As the war expanded, so did Flossenbürg. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, pastors, intellectuals, men marked as enemies of the Reich. Even officers involved in the plot to kill Hitler would be brought here, executed in the regime's final days, when collapse was already inevitable. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. Flossenbürg. Origins of a Labor Camp, 1938. Flossenbürg began not with mass murder, but with a calculation. In the spring of 1938, as Nazi Germany prepared itself for expansion and war, the SS searched for places where ideology, economics, and control could be fused into a single system. Northern Bavaria, near the small village of Flossenbürg, offered what the regime needed: isolation, rail access, and above all, granite. Hard, durable stone that could be quarried in enormous quantities and fed directly into Hitler's architectural dreams for a monumental Reich. The surrounding forests and hills were quiet, sparsely populated, and politically compliant. What would happen there could remain unseen. In May 1938, construction began, and by the end of the month, the first prisoners arrived. They were not greeted by finished barracks or infrastructure. Instead, they were forced to build the camp that would imprison them. Flossenbürg was born through prisoner labor, and from the very beginning, suffering was embedded into its design. The camp was initially administered by the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, which oversaw concentration camps not as detention centers, but as assets. Prisoners were categorized not by guilt or innocence, but by usefulness. Political opponents of the regime, particularly communists, social democrats, and other so-called asocials, made up the first transports. These men were labeled enemies of the state, stripped of legal identity, and reduced to numbered bodies. Upon arrival, they were shaved, beaten, and assigned colored triangles that marked them permanently within the camp hierarchy. From the first roll call, discipline was enforced through terror. Any sign of weakness, confusion, or resistance was met with punishment. Flossenbürg did not need gas chambers to establish control. Violence was immediate, public, and constant. At the center of the camp's purpose was the granite quarry at the base of the hill. Prisoners were marched there daily under armed guard, often before sunrise, regardless of weather or physical condition. The quarry was not simply a work site. It was the heart of the camp's killing mechanism. Granite blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms were extracted by hand, lifted without machinery, and hauled upward on crude paths. The labor was relentless and intentionally inefficient. Exhaustion was not a side effect, it was the goal. SS guards measured success not by productivity alone, but by how completely the work stripped prisoners of strength, dignity, and hope. Those who slowed were beaten. Those who collapsed were left where they fell, sometimes trampled by others forced to continue moving. Death was not hidden. It was meant to be seen. Flossenbürg was classified as a camp of corrective labor, but this was a lie even by Nazi standards. From the beginning, survival was statistically unlikely. Food rations were calculated to sustain work just long enough to extract maximum labor before the body failed. Water was limited. Medical care was virtually non-existent unless it served experimental or disciplinary purposes. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded barracks built with poor ventilation and no sanitation. Lice, dysentery, and respiratory infections became endemic within months. The SS did not intervene to stop these conditions. They observed them, refined them, and allowed them to function as part of the system. Commandants and guards assigned to Flossenbürg were often men seeking advancement within the SS hierarchy. The camp became a proving ground not only for prisoners, but for SS personnel learning how to enforce absolute authority. Punishment routines were formalized early. Standing cells, whipping frames, public hangings, and forced exercises designed to humiliate and injure. These were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were regulated procedures recorded in logs and approved through bureaucratic channels. Terror was standardized. Pain was scheduled. Flossenbürg demonstrated how violence could be made routine, how brutality could be embedded into daily administration without chaos. As 1938 turned into 1939, the camp expanded rapidly. New barracks were added, built by prisoners whose labor shortened their own lives. The quarry increased output, feeding stone into SS-owned companies that profited directly from prisoner exploitation. Flossenbürg was no longer merely a camp, it was a node in the Nazi economic system. Human beings were the raw material. Their exhaustion was predictable. Their deaths were anticipated.
Replacement transport ensure de continuity.
When one body failed, another arrived. The early months of Flossenbürg reveal the core truth of the camp system before the Holocaust reached its most infamous stage. Genocide did not begin with extermination camps alone. It began with places like this, where law was suspended, labor was weaponized, and death was produced slowly enough to be rationalized as work. In Flossenbürg, the Nazi state learned how to make suffering efficient. And once learned, it would never be unlearned. This was only the beginning. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Flossenbürg, Prisoners, Power, and the Architecture of Control. By the end of 1938, Flossenbürg had already settled into its true function. What began as a quarry labor camp was rapidly evolving into a fully structured system of domination, one that relied not only on brute force, but on hierarchy, fear, and psychological control. The SS understood early that total power did not come from violence alone. It came from forcing prisoners to participate in their own oppression. At Flossenbürg, the camp's internal structure was designed to fracture solidarity and replace it with suspicion, competition, and obedience. Every prisoner was assigned a place in a carefully engineered order, one that mirrored the Nazi worldview down to its smallest detail. Upon arrival, prisoners were immediately classified. Political prisoners wore red triangles. Criminal prisoners wore green. Asocials were marked in black. Jehovah's Witnesses were given purple. Jews, initially a smaller group in Flossenbürg's early years, were forced to wear yellow markings that placed them at the very bottom of the camp hierarchy. These symbols were not just identifiers. They determined who would be beaten, who would be assigned the most lethal labor, who would be denied food, and who could be killed without consequence. The SS encouraged hostility between groups, rewarding informants and punishing those who showed empathy. Survival often depended not on strength, but on navigating a system designed to destroy trust. Central to this structure were the prisoner functionaries, capos, block elders, and work supervisors selected by the SS. Many were chosen from among criminal prisoners, men the SS believed were more willing to use violence against fellow inmates. These positions came with privileges: slightly better food, marginal protection from punishment, and the illusion of power. In return, capos were expected to maintain order through brutality. They enforced quotas, beat weaker prisoners, and reported resistance. The SS watched closely, intervening only when discipline faltered. In this way, Flossenbürg functioned as a self-policing machine. Violence flowed downward, rarely upward, creating a closed system where cruelty was normalized and accountability vanished. Daily life in the camp followed a rigid, exhausting rhythm. Prisoners were woken before dawn by shouting and blows. Roll calls could last hours, regardless of weather, as prisoners stood motionless while guards counted and recounted bodies. The dead were included, propped upright to meet numbers. Any discrepancy resulted in collective punishment. After roll call came forced marches to labor sites, the quarry, construction details, workshops, or road-building projects. Food consisted of watery soup, a scrap of bread, and occasionally a sliver of margarine. The caloric intake was nowhere near enough to sustain the physical demands placed on the prisoners. Weight loss was rapid. Muscle deteriorated. Injuries never healed. Punishment at Flossenbürg was systematic and public. Prisoners accused of infractions, real or invented, were beaten in front of others as a warning. Whipping posts stood in open areas of the camp. Hangings were staged as spectacles, forcing prisoners to watch the slow death of their fellow inmates. Solitary confinement cells were dark, cramped, and deliberately designed to break the mind. Some prisoners were forced to stand for days in punishment blocks, denied sleep and water. The goal was not justice. It was demonstration. The SS wanted fear to become instinctive, obedience automatic. Medical care, such as it existed, served the SS rather than the prisoners. Sick inmates were often denied treatment and sent back to work until they collapsed. Those deemed unfit for labor were selected out, transferred, or quietly allowed to die. In some cases, camp doctors conducted experiments under the guise of research, testing vaccines, exposure limits, and endurance thresholds. These experiments were not isolated acts of sadism. They were part of a broader effort to quantify how much suffering the human body could endure before failure. Knowledge gained in places like Flossenbürg would later be applied elsewhere across the camp system. As Germany moved closer to war, Flossenbürg's importance grew. The quarry expanded, and new construction projects tied the camp directly into the Nazi war economy. Prisoners were no longer just extracting stone for symbolic architecture. They were being prepared for mass exploitation. The SS refined transport logistics, intake procedures, and labor deployment. Each improvement increased efficiency. Each adjustment reduced the chance of resistance. Flossenbürg became a laboratory of control, demonstrating how a camp could function continuously with minimal oversight, driven by fear and exhaustion alone. What made Flossenbürg especially dangerous was not only its violence, but its invisibility. Located far from major cities, shielded by forests and hills, the camp operated beyond the view of most civilians. Local populations knew something was happening, but not the scale or the intent. The SS relied on this distance. Silence was part of the system. The fewer witnesses, the easier it was to normalize the abnormal. By the time war began in 1939, Flossenbürg was already a mature instrument of repression. A place where suffering had been optimized, where death occurred daily without chaos, and where the machinery of terror ran smoothly. This segment of Flossenbürg's history reveals a critical truth. The camp did not descend into brutality by accident. It was designed, tested, and perfected. Every rule, every hierarchy, every punishment served a purpose. And once this model proved effective, it would not remain confined to one hill in Bavaria. It would spread. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Flossenbürg. The quarry, the body, and the economy of exhaustion. By the time Flossenbürg entered full operation, the granite quarry beneath the camp had become its beating heart and its primary instrument of destruction. Everything in the camp revolved around stone. The SS did not merely see the quarry as a source of building material. They saw it as a tool to extract the maximum amount of labor from human bodies before those bodies failed. From the first days of incarceration, prisoners learned that survival at Flossenbürg was measured not in weeks or months, but in how long one could endure the quarry's relentless demands. Each morning, columns of prisoners were marched down the steep paths toward the pit, guarded by armed SS men and overseers with truncheons. The descent itself was dangerous, especially in winter, when ice turned the ground slick and visibility was poor. Once inside the quarry, the work began immediately. Prisoners drilled, blasted, cut, and hauled massive granite blocks using primitive tools. There were no safety measures. Injuries were constant: crushed fingers, shattered bones, torn muscles. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who collapsed were dragged aside and often left unattended, exposed to cold, heat, or further blows until death followed. The physical toll was deliberate. Rations were calibrated to keep prisoners alive but permanently weakened. Hunger dulled the senses, slowed reflexes, and made accidents more likely. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Disease spread quickly among men whose bodies no longer had the strength to resist infection. The SS understood this perfectly. They did not seek efficiency in the modern industrial sense. They sought depletion. Every block of stone extracted represented not just labor, but the gradual destruction of the worker who carried it. One of the most feared features of the quarry was the steep stairway carved into the rock face. Prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks up these steps, often weighing more than the men themselves. Guards watched closely, waiting for weakness. A stumble could trigger a cascade, as falling prisoners knocked others down with them. In some cases, guards pushed men deliberately, turning accidents into executions disguised as mishaps. The stairway became a place where death was routine and unremarkable, absorbed into the daily rhythm of work. The quarry also served a symbolic purpose. The SS believed that forcing prisoners, particularly political enemies and intellectuals, into brutal manual labor was a form of ideological punishment. It was meant to humiliate, to erase identity, to reduce individuals to raw muscle and pain. Education, profession, and past life held no value here. A professor and a factory worker were treated the same, their worth measured only by how much stone they could move before collapsing. In this way, Flossenbürg was not just exploiting bodies. It was attempting to annihilate personhood itself. As the Nazi regime expanded its construction ambitions, the stone from Flossenbürg was incorporated into grand architectural projects envisioned by the leadership. Monuments, government buildings, and symbolic structures were planned using granite quarried by starving prisoners. The SS framed this as contribution to the Reich, but for those inside the camp, it meant only prolonged suffering. The connection between labor and national purpose was never explained to prisoners. It did not need to be. Pain was justification enough. Over time, the quarry's role grew more tightly integrated with the SS economic system. The camp administration tracked output meticulously, noting how many blocks were extracted, how many workers were lost, and how quickly replacements could be supplied. Death was factored into planning. New transports ensured a steady flow of labor, allowing the system to continue uninterrupted. In this way, Flossenbürg demonstrated a grim principle that would define much of the Nazi camp network. Human beings were renewable resources, replaceable as long as trains kept arriving. For prisoners, the quarry destroyed any illusion of duration. Time collapsed into a cycle of work, hunger, pain, and sleep, repeated endlessly. Days blurred together. Seasons passed almost unnoticed. Hope became dangerous because it could distract from the discipline required to survive another hour. Some prisoners adapted by narrowing their focus to the smallest tasks. Lifting one stone, taking one step, surviving one roll call. Others simply shut down, becoming what fellow inmates called muselmänner, living bodies already abandoned by life. By the end of Flossenbürg's first operational phase, the quarry had claimed thousands of lives. Yet, from the perspective of the SS, the camp was functioning as intended. Production continued. Order was maintained. Resistance was minimal. The system had proven itself capable of extracting labor until death without widespread rebellion. That success would ensure Flossenbürg's expansion and its transformation from a single camp into the nucleus of a much larger forced labor complex. This segment of Flossenbürg's history reveals the core logic of the camp. It was not chaos. It was design. Every stone carried upward represented the slow erasure of a human life, measured, observed, and accepted as normal. And as long as the quarry continued to yield granite, the suffering beneath it remained invisible, buried under the weight of stone and silence. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Expansion and Control. Flossenbürg becomes a camp system. By the early years of the Second World War, Flossenbürg was no longer a single, isolated camp carved into the Bavarian countryside. It was becoming something far more complex and far more dangerous. As Germany's war economy expanded and the demand for labor intensified, the SS transformed Flossenbürg into the center of a growing network of subcamps designed to extract human labor wherever it could be most efficiently consumed. This shift marked a critical evolution in the camp's purpose. From a brutal quarry-based camp to a decentralized system of forced labor feeding directly into the machinery of war. The logic behind this expansion was rooted in necessity, not mercy. By 1941 and 1942, German industry was under immense strain. Millions of German men had been sent to the front. Factories faced labor shortages. Raw materials needed to be extracted, processed, assembled, and transported at an unprecedented scale. The SS offered a solution. Concentration camp prisoners, already stripped of rights and rendered invisible, could be deployed as a captive workforce, cheap, controllable, and expendable. Flossenbürg, with its established administrative structure and proximity to industrial regions, became a natural hub. New satellite camps began to appear across Bavaria, Saxony, and Bohemia. Some were attached to quarries. Others were built near armaments factories, aircraft plants, synthetic fuel facilities, and underground construction sites. Prisoners were transferred from the main camp to these locations in waves, often without explanation. Many arrived believing they were being moved to lighter work. In reality, conditions were often worse. Subcamps lacked the minimal infrastructure of Flossenbürg itself. Barracks were improvised. Food supplies were even more limited. Medical care was non-existent. Guards were frequently more violent, operating with less oversight and greater impunity. Control within this expanding system relied on a rigid hierarchy. SS officers sat at the top, issuing orders and managing quotas. Beneath them were capos, prisoners appointed as overseers who enforced discipline within work details. This structure served two purposes. It reduced the number of SS personnel required, and it fractured prisoner solidarity. By forcing inmates into roles that required them to discipline others, the SS blurred the lines between victim and instrument. Survival often depended on compliance, and compliance came at a moral cost that many prisoners carried long after the war. Classification became increasingly important as the system grew. Prisoners were divided by nationality, religion, political background, and perceived usefulness. Skilled workers, machinists, engineers, electricians were singled out for industrial labor. Others were deemed unskilled and assigned to the most physically destructive tasks. Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and those labeled asocial were typically given the hardest work with the least chance of survival. These distinctions were not subtle. Colored triangles sewn onto uniforms made hierarchy visible at a glance, reinforcing divisions and reminding prisoners of their assigned place within the camp's internal order. Transportation between camps was brutal in itself. Prisoners were packed into freight cars with little food or water, sometimes traveling for days. Many arrived already ill or injured. Those unable to work upon arrival were often sent back, or simply removed from the system entirely through execution or neglect. In this way, movement within the Flossenbürg network became another filter, separating those who could still be exploited from those who had nothing left to give. As the war intensified, secrecy increased. Some subcamps were located near sensitive military installations. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking to civilians. Contact with the outside world was almost completely severed. Even within the camp system, information was tightly controlled. Prisoners often had no idea where they were or what they were producing. This isolation served a psychological function. Disorientation weakened resistance. Uncertainty made survival feel temporary and fragile, discouraging long-term planning or organized defiance. Despite these conditions, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared information in whispers, passed scraps of food, warned one another of inspections or dangerous guards. In some subcamps, clandestine networks formed, linking workers across different sites. These networks were fragile and easily destroyed, but they demonstrated that even within a system designed to isolate and atomize, cooperation could still emerge. The SS responded harshly when such efforts were discovered, using public punishments to reinforce fear and obedience. By the midpoint of the war, Flossenbürg's transformation was complete. It was no longer defined solely by its quarry, but by its role as a labor reservoir feeding dozens of industrial sites. The camp's identity had shifted from punishment to production, though punishment never disappeared. Death rates remained high. Exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, and violence continued to claim lives daily. But now, suffering served a broader function. Every prisoner who survived another day of labor contributed directly to the Reich's ability to wage war. This phase of Flossenbürg's history reveals a crucial truth about the Nazi camp system. It was not static. It adapted, expanded, and integrated itself into nearly every aspect of the German economy. Camps like Flossenbürg were not failures of civilization operating at its margins. They were embedded within it, supplying materials, manufacturing weapons, and sustaining the illusion of national strength through the systematic destruction of human lives. As the network grew, so did its reach and its silence. The suffering of prisoners was hidden behind contracts, quotas, and production reports. Death became a statistic. Labor became a weapon. And Flossenbürg, once a quarry camp on a remote hill, had become a central node in a system that transformed captivity into an industrial process, one that would continue to expand until the very end of the war. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Industry, Profit, and Exhaustion. How Flossenbürg fed the Nazi war machine. As Flossenbürg expanded into a network of subcamps, its function became inseparable from the Nazi war economy. This stage marked the moment when ideology, bureaucracy, and industrial demand fully fused, transforming the camp from a site of repression into a carefully managed reservoir of expendable labor. By this point in the war, the SS no longer justified Flossenbürg merely as a place of punishment or re-education. It was now an economic asset, Every prisoner was measured not by humanity, but by output, endurance, and how long their body could be kept functioning before collapse. The SS entered into direct partnerships with German companies, both state-run and private. Firms involved in armaments, aircraft production, vehicle manufacturing, and construction submitted labor requests to the SS, specifying numbers, skill sets, and delivery timelines. In return, they paid the SS a daily fee per prisoner. This arrangement was chillingly transactional. Prisoners were leased like tools. If one broke, another could be supplied. Death did not interrupt production. It was factored into planning. At Flossenbürg and its subcamps, forced labor took many forms. Some prisoners returned daily to the granite quarries, where stone was extracted for monumental architecture projects envisioned by the regime. Others were sent into factories assembling aircraft components, munitions, engines, and precision parts. As Allied bombing intensified, production increasingly moved underground. Prisoners were forced to carve tunnels into mountainsides and hills, creating vast subterranean facilities where weapons could be manufactured beyond the reach of air raids. These underground sites were among the most lethal. Poor ventilation, constant dust, unstable rock, and extreme physical strain killed thousands without a single bullet being fired. Workdays stretched far beyond what the human body could sustain. Shifts commonly lasted 12 hours or more, often with forced marches to and from work sites added on either end. Food rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to prolong usefulness just enough to extract maximum labor. Prisoners survived on thin soup, small pieces of bread, and occasional substitutes made from inedible scraps. Weight loss was rapid and extreme. Men who entered the system healthy were reduced to skeletal forms within weeks. Exhaustion was not an unintended consequence. It was a mechanism of control. A prisoner too tired to think was less likely to resist. A body pushed to the edge of collapse could still swing a hammer or carry a load, but had no strength left for defiance. Guards exploited this vulnerability mercilessly. Beatings were common, often delivered for failing to meet quotas that were physically impossible to achieve. Falling behind was interpreted as sabotage. Slowing down was seen as defiance. Both were punishable by death. The camp administration tracked productivity obsessively. Daily work reports documented output, delays, and losses. Prisoner deaths were recorded with clinical detachment, categorized as illness, weakness, or natural causes. There was no contradiction in this language. The system was designed so that death appeared administrative rather than violent. The paperwork hid the reality that the labor itself was the cause of death. Medical care, when it existed at all, served the system rather than the patient. Prisoners who collapsed were evaluated not for recovery, but for remaining usefulness. Those deemed temporarily salvageable were returned to work after minimal treatment. Those considered beyond recovery were removed from labor rosters. Some were sent back to the main camp. Others were executed or left to die through neglect. Selection was constant, quiet, and relentless. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Prisoners lived under the constant pressure of quotas they could not meet and punishments they could not escape. Hope was dangerous. To believe in survival meant enduring another day of unbearable labor. Many prisoners described a state of emotional numbness, a narrowing of existence to the next step, the next breath, the next command. Identity dissolved. Time lost meaning. Life became a cycle of work, pain, and exhaustion. Yet even within this system, small acts of resistance emerged. Prisoners sabotaged machinery when they could, filing parts incorrectly or weakening components in ways difficult to detect. Skilled workers sometimes protected weaker prisoners by redistributing tasks or slowing production collectively, hoping to reduce individual punishment. These acts were incredibly risky. Discovery often meant execution, but they represented a refusal to allow the system total control, a quiet assertion that even within forced labor, conscience could still exist. The SS responded by tightening discipline. Public beatings, hangings, and roll call punishments increased. Entire work details were punished for the actions of one prisoner. This collective punishment strategy deepened fear and mistrust, isolating prisoners from one another. It was deliberate. A divided workforce was easier to control and less capable of resistance. By this stage, Flossenbürg's purpose was fully revealed. It was not merely a camp that used labor. It was a system that weaponized labor, turning work into a slow, grinding method of extermination that left few visible traces. There were no gas chambers here on the scale of extermination camps, but the outcome was often the same. Bodies were consumed by work, starved by policy, and discarded when empty. This phase of Flossenbürg exposes a crucial dimension of the Holocaust that is often overlooked. Genocide did not rely solely on moments of mass killing. It also unfolded through schedules, contracts, quotas, and industrial planning. The destruction of human life was embedded in routine operations, normalized through paperwork and justified through productivity. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation deteriorated, the pressure on camps like Flossenbürg only increased. More labor was demanded from fewer bodies. Survival margins narrowed, and the camp moved steadily toward the final phase of its existence, one defined not by expansion, but by collapse, desperation, and the attempt to erase what had been built through suffering. That reckoning was coming. But for now, Flossenbürg continued to function as intended, a place where labor fed the Reich and human lives were consumed in the process. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Breaking the Body, Erasing the Person. Daily life under total exhaustion at Flossenbürg. By the time Flossenbürg reached full operational maturity, daily life inside the camp was no longer defined by uncertainty. It was defined by inevitability. Every prisoner understood the rhythm of the system, and every part of that rhythm was designed to grind the human body and spirit down until nothing recognizable remained. Survival was no longer a question of strength alone. It became a test of how long a person could exist inside a structure that treated exhaustion as policy and suffering as routine. Each day began before dawn, often in darkness and freezing air. Prisoners were dragged from overcrowded barracks by whistles, shouts, and blows. Roll call followed, a ritual that could last hours, regardless of weather or physical condition. Men stood motionless while SS guards counted and recounted bodies, sometimes as punishment, sometimes due to bureaucratic obsession, sometimes simply to assert power. Prisoners who collapsed during roll call were beaten or left to die where they fell. The living were forced to stand beside the dead until counting was complete. After roll call came work assignments. Prisoners were organized into labor details based on perceived usefulness, not health. A man coughing blood could still be sent to the quarry. A prisoner barely able to stand could still be marched to a factory site. Weakness was not grounds for rest, it was evidence of failure, and failure was treated as defiance. Marches to work sites were themselves instruments of punishment. Prisoners were forced to move at unnatural speeds, often running despite malnutrition and illness. Guards beat those who stumbled. Those who could not keep pace were dragged, kicked, or shot. By the time work began, many were already exhausted beyond recovery. Labor inside the quarries and factories was relentless. In the stone pits, prisoners hauled massive granite blocks using primitive tools under constant supervision. Dust filled their lungs. Cuts went untreated. Falls were common and often fatal. In factories and underground facilities, work required precision despite starvation and fatigue. Errors brought punishment. Mistakes were interpreted as sabotage. Even accidental damage could lead to execution. Food rations were deliberately insufficient. Meals consisted of watery soup made from turnips or scraps, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a thin substitute for coffee. Calories were carefully calculated to keep prisoners barely functional, enough to work, but never enough to recover. Hunger became a constant presence, shaping thoughts, dreams, and behavior. Prisoners described hallucinations of food, obsessive fantasies about meals from their past lives, and overwhelming despair triggered by the sight of crumbs. Disease spread unchecked. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created ideal conditions for infections. Dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and skin diseases were widespread. Lice infested clothing and bedding. Medical care was minimal and conditional. Prisoner doctors, themselves starving, were forced to make impossible decisions: who might recover and who was already considered lost. Those deemed too weak were removed from work details and sent back to the camp infirmary, a place feared almost as much as the quarry. For many, entering the infirmary was the final step before death. Beds were scarce, supplies non-existent. Prisoners lay stacked together, untreated, waiting. Some were transferred to other camps. Others disappeared quietly. Punishment was constant and arbitrary. Beatings were administered publicly to reinforce fear. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours with arms raised, tied to posts, or confined in punishment cells without food or water. Executions were staged as warnings. Entire labor groups were punished for the perceived failure of one individual. The goal was not correction, it was submission. Over time, identity eroded. Prisoners were stripped not only of names, but of memory and individuality. Uniforms replaced clothing. Numbers replaced identity. Language narrowed to commands and survival signals. Days blurred together. Many prisoners later described a sense of watching themselves disappear, becoming something smaller, quieter, more mechanical. Yet even in this environment, humanity did not vanish completely. Prisoners shared food when they could. Some whispered encouragement during marches. Others preserved fragments of culture, reciting poems from memory, exchanging stories of their former lives, or marking days in secret. These acts carried immense risk, but they sustained a sense of self in a system designed to erase it. The SS understood this danger. Psychological control was as important as physical domination. Guards deliberately humiliated prisoners, forcing them to witness executions, mock the dying, or participate in punishments. The message was clear. Compassion would be punished, empathy was weakness, and resistance, even emotional, was futile. As months passed, the cumulative effects became visible everywhere. Bodies wasted away, barracks filled with coughing, moaning, and silence. The dead were removed daily, sometimes stacked like refuse. Cremation facilities struggled to keep pace. The camp functioned like a machine consuming its own fuel, human beings reduced to energy, then ash. This was Flossenbürg at its core. Not a sudden eruption of violence, but a sustained environment of destruction. Death came not only from blows or bullets, but from schedules, quotas, and indifference. The system did not require constant killing, it required time. And time was exactly what Flossenbürg provided. As the war intensified and Germany's losses mounted, the pressure on prisoners only increased. More labor was demanded from fewer bodies. The line between life and death grew thinner each day, and the camp, already brutal, moved steadily toward its final and most chaotic phase, where exhaustion, evacuation, and collapse would converge. That final phase was approaching. Chapter 3, Segment 1. From Camp to Industry. Flossenbürg and the Nazi War Economy. By the early years of the Second World War, Flossenbürg was no longer operating merely as a place of confinement or punishment. It had become something far more deliberate, a functional component of the Nazi war economy. What began as a quarry camp supplying granite for monumental architecture was systematically transformed into an industrial labor reservoir, where human lives were measured not by survival, but by output. This shift marked a decisive turning point in the camp's history, one that would dramatically increase suffering while tying Flossenbürg directly to Germany's ability to wage war. As German military expansion accelerated after 1939, the regime faced a growing labor crisis. Millions of German men were pulled into the armed forces, leaving factories, construction sites, and armament plants understaffed. Rather than slow production, the Nazi leadership turned to forced labor on an unprecedented scale. Concentration camps were no longer just instruments of terror, they became engines of production, fueled by prisoners who could be worked until they collapsed and then replaced. Flossenbürg was uniquely positioned to serve this purpose. Its remote location, established infrastructure, and already brutal labor discipline made it an ideal site for industrial expansion. SS administrators actively sought contracts with private firms and state-run enterprises, offering prisoners as a cheap, expendable workforce. Companies paid the SS directly for each laborer assigned, turning human suffering into a profitable transaction. Factories began to appear in and around the camp. Workshops were constructed inside the perimeter, while satellite facilities emerged in nearby towns and forests. Prisoners were marched daily to these sites under guard, often before dawn and long after sunset. The work varied: precision manufacturing, metal processing, aircraft components, and later underground production, but the conditions were universally lethal. Starvation rations remained unchanged, even as workloads intensified. The transformation was bureaucratic, methodical, and chillingly efficient. Prisoners were reclassified not as individuals, but as labor units. Camp records tracked productivity, absenteeism, and mortality with equal detachment. Those who became too weak to work were labeled unfit and removed, sometimes sent to other camps, sometimes left to die, sometimes executed outright. Replacement prisoners arrived continuously, ensuring the system never slowed. Inside the factories, discipline was enforced with violence. SS guards and civilian overseers monitored production closely. Mistakes were punished as sabotage. Delays were treated as defiance. Exhaustion was irrelevant. Prisoners were expected to meet quotas regardless of illness, injury, or starvation. Even a moment of rest could provoke a beating. The factory floor became an extension of the camp's terror, a place where survival depended on invisible calculations and relentless pressure. For many prisoners, this shift erased any remaining illusion of survival through compliance. Quarry labor was brutal, but industrial labor demanded precision from bodies already breaking apart. Hands shook from hunger, eyes blurred from fatigue, yet errors could be fatal. Prisoners described the constant fear of being singled out, not for rebellion but for weakness. As production increased, so did the SS dependence on prisoner labor. This dependency created a grim paradox. Prisoners were both disposable and essential. They were treated as expendable, yet the system relied on their continued existence just long enough to extract value. This tension drove camp policy. Prisoners were not kept alive out of mercy, but out of utility. Medical neglect became policy. Injuries were ignored unless they threatened production. Prisoner doctors were ordered to return men to work prematurely. Sick prisoners were pressured to conceal illness to avoid selection. Many died at their workstations. Others were carried back to the camp at night, lifeless, their deaths recorded as natural causes. Children and adolescents were not spared. As labor demands intensified, younger prisoners were assigned to lighter tasks that were still far beyond their physical capacity. Their small size made them useful in cramped industrial spaces. Their mortality rates were catastrophic. The expansion of forced labor also multiplied Flossenbürg's network of subcamps. Dozens of satellite camps were established across the region, each linked to a specific industrial project. Conditions in these subcamps were often worse than in the main camp: fewer resources, harsher discipline, and near-total isolation. Prisoners sent there vanished from collective memory, swallowed by a system designed to extract labor quietly and kill efficiently. What made this phase especially insidious was its appearance of normalcy. Factories operated on schedules. Paperwork flowed. Production targets were met. Civilians worked alongside prisoners, witnessing their condition daily. Trucks moved goods out. Trains carried supplies in. The machinery of war continued, powered by bodies that were deliberately destroyed in the process. Flossenbürg was no longer just a camp hidden in the forest. It was integrated into Germany's industrial bloodstream. Every aircraft part produced, every component assembled, carried the imprint of forced labor. The camp's existence was no longer incidental to the war, it was fundamental to it. And as Germany's situation worsened, the demands placed on Flossenbürg would only grow harsher. More prisoners would arrive. More work would be demanded. And the line between labor and execution would blur even further. The camp had become a factory of suffering, and it was only beginning to reach its deadliest form. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Subcamps. A network designed to consume human life. As Flossenbürg became increasingly embedded in the Nazi war economy, the camp expanded far beyond its original fences. What emerged was not a single site of suffering, but a sprawling network of subcamps stretching across Bavaria, Saxony, and into occupied territories. By the height of the war, Flossenbürg controlled dozens of satellite camps, each one designed with a single purpose: to extract as much labor as possible from prisoners before their bodies failed completely. These subcamps were not accidental byproducts of overcrowding. They were planned extensions of the system. Each was tied directly to a factory, construction project, quarry, or underground installation vital to the German war effort. Aircraft production, weapons assembly, engine parts, synthetic fuel facilities, and secret armament sites all relied on this hidden labor force. Where a factory needed workers, a camp appeared nearby. Life in the subcamps was often even more brutal than in the main camp. Prisoners were housed in improvised barracks, abandoned schools, barns, warehouses, half-finished buildings, or wooden huts hastily erected near industrial sites. These structures offered little protection from cold, heat, or disease. Food rations were smaller. Medical care was almost non-existent. Guards were fewer, but more violent, operating with minimal oversight and wide discretion to punish or kill. Prisoners assigned to subcamps were effectively erased. They were separated from the limited support networks that sometimes existed in the main camp: fellow countrymen, resistance groups, or prisoner functionaries who might offer small protection. In the subcamps, isolation was complete. Many prisoners later testified that being transferred to a subcamp felt like a death sentence, even if no execution order was given. Workdays stretched endlessly. Prisoners were driven from their barracks before dawn and forced to labor until darkness fell. In underground factories, there was no natural light at all. Only artificial illumination, thick dust, toxic fumes, and constant noise. Air was scarce. Accidents were frequent. Cave-ins, machinery failures, and explosions killed workers regularly. Yet production never stopped. SS guards and civilian supervisors enforced discipline together. Civilian foremen, engineers, and factory managers were not passive observers. Many actively demanded harsher treatment, complained when prisoners slowed, and requested replacements when workers collapsed. The SS complied without hesitation. Human beings were interchangeable parts in an industrial process. Illness spread unchecked. Tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, and infections ravaged subcamp populations. Prisoners too sick to work were beaten to force movement, abandoned without care, or transported back to Flossenbürg, where many were sent directly to die. Others never made the journey back. Their deaths went unrecorded, absorbed into the statistics of labor loss. Hunger was constant. Prisoners described working heavy industrial machinery while consuming fewer calories than a child. Bread rations shrank. Soup became thinner. Starvation weakened muscles, slowed reflexes, and made precision work nearly impossible. Yet mistakes were punished mercilessly. Many were beaten for errors caused by exhaustion they could not escape. Women and adolescents were also sent into the subcamp system as labor demands intensified. Younger prisoners were prized for their smaller size, useful in cramped tunnels or delicate assembly tasks. Their mortality was staggering. Teenagers collapsed at workstations, fainted from hunger, or were killed for failing to keep pace. Some subcamps specialized in underground production, a response to Allied bombing. Prisoners were forced to dig massive tunnel systems into mountainsides, often using primitive tools. These tunnels became factories hidden beneath the earth, where air was stale, lighting poor, and safety non-existent. Prisoners worked knee-deep in water or choking dust. Many suffocated slowly from lung damage long before death was recorded. The SS described these camps as essential. Prisoners described them as places where time disappeared. Days blurred into a single cycle of labor, pain, and fear. There were no roll call rituals that offered moments of rest. No structured routines beyond work itself. Survival depended on luck, physical resilience, and the arbitrary mood of guards. Despite the crushing conditions, resistance did not vanish entirely. Small acts persisted. Stolen tools sabotaged machinery. Parts were subtly damaged. Work slowed in ways difficult to detect. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery often meant public execution or collective punishment. Entire work details could be beaten or deprived of food in retaliation. The subcamp system also allowed the SS to distance themselves from death. Prisoners died far from the main camp, scattered across forests, factories, and construction sites. Their suffering remained largely invisible, even to other prisoners. This diffusion of violence made the system harder to track, easier to deny, and deadlier in total. By the later years of the war, Flossenbürg's subcamps held more prisoners than the main camp itself. The network had become the camp. Death no longer needed a central location. It occurred wherever labor was demanded. What unified these scattered sites was not geography but intent. Every subcamp followed the same logic: extract labor until collapse, then replace the body.
No rehabilitation.
No recovery. No future beyond usefulness. Flossenbürg had evolved into a decentralized machine of destruction, one that could function anywhere, anytime, as long as there were prisoners left to consume. And as Germany's defeat drew closer, the pressure on this system would intensify further, pushing it toward its most chaotic and lethal phase yet. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Human Cost. How the system broke body and mind. By the time Flossenbürg's subcamp network reached its full scale, the camp system was no longer merely extracting labor. It was systematically dismantling human beings, piece by piece. The violence was not always loud. It did not always arrive with bullets or gallows. Most often, it came quietly, through exhaustion that never ended, hunger that never eased, and fear that seeped into every moment of waking life. Prisoners arrived at Flossenbürg already weakened. Many had endured arrests, interrogations, transport in overcrowded cattle cars, and weeks or months of starvation before ever stepping inside the camp. What awaited them was not stabilization but acceleration, a system designed to push the human body past its limits as quickly as possible without stopping production. The physical destruction began immediately. Prisoners were stripped, shaved, deloused with chemicals that burned the skin, and issued thin uniforms unsuitable for the climate. Shoes were often mismatched, broken, or absent altogether. In winter, frostbite became common within days. In summer, dehydration and heat exhaustion claimed lives just as efficiently. The body was never allowed to recover. Work assignments ignored age, health, or prior condition. Men weakened by illness were sent to quarries. Those with injuries were ordered to lift stone or operate heavy machinery. Prisoners with fevers were beaten awake and forced to march. Falling behind was interpreted as sabotage. Sabotage was punishable by death. Beatings were routine and public. Guards struck prisoners with rifle butts, whips, sticks, and fists, not only for disobedience but to assert control. Punishments were often arbitrary. A glance held too long. Posture deemed disrespectful. Collapse during roll call. Violence served not just to discipline, but to demonstrate absolute power. Starvation was the backbone of control. Daily rations were carefully calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work, but never strong enough to resist. Bread portions shrank steadily. Soup was often little more than warm water with floating scraps. Meat was rare. Vegetables were rotten. Hunger became an obsession that consumed thought, memory, and emotion.
Men fought over crumbs.
Some risked their lives stealing potato peels from garbage pits. Others traded shoes, clothing, or favors for food. Those who failed to secure extra nourishment faded quickly. Muscles wasting, bones protruding, skin tightening over hollow faces. Starvation did not kill suddenly. It dismantled the body slowly, making death feel inevitable long before it arrived. Disease flourished in these conditions. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, and infected wounds spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks. Lice infested clothing and bedding. Washing facilities were inadequate or non-existent. Medical care was reserved for those deemed valuable enough to return to work. Others were ignored, isolated, or sent away. The camp infirmary was not a place of healing. It was often a waiting room for death. Beds were overcrowded. Supplies were scarce. Prisoner doctors were forced to choose who might survive and who would be left untreated. Many sick prisoners avoided the infirmary entirely, knowing that admission could mark them for transport or execution. Psychological destruction was just as deliberate. Prisoners were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. Identity vanished. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together under relentless routine. Hope became dangerous, something that could break a person when it failed. Guards exploited this instability, alternating cruelty with false promises to maintain control. Public executions were staged to reinforce terror. Prisoners were forced to watch hangings, shootings, and beatings until death. These acts were meant to destroy solidarity and instill obedience. The message was clear. Resistance would not only cost your life, but be used as a warning to others. Children and adolescents suffered uniquely. Though fewer in number, their presence revealed the system's total disregard for age or innocence. Young prisoners were worked alongside adults, beaten the same, starved the same, and killed the same. Many did not survive their first months. Women transferred into Flossenbürg's orbit through subcamps faced additional brutality. Sexual violence, humiliation, and exploitation layered atop forced labor. Their suffering was often hidden, unrecorded, and dismissed even after the war. Despite everything, humanity did not vanish entirely. Small acts of solidarity endured. Prisoners shared food when possible. Some helped the sick stand during roll call. Others whispered news from the outside world, keeping hope alive in fragments. These moments were fragile, easily crushed, yet deeply meaningful. Resistance also survived in subtle forms. Work was sabotaged quietly. Tools were damaged. Production slowed by fractions of seconds that added up over time. Information was passed between camps. Survival itself became an act of defiance, living one more day in a system designed to erase you. The cost of this resistance was immense. Discovery meant torture or death. Entire work details could be punished collectively. Yet even knowing this, prisoners continued. Not because they believed they would win, but because surrendering entirely meant becoming what the system wanted. Silent, compliant, erased. By the later stages of the war, Flossenbürg's mortality rate soared. Death became so common it ceased to shock. Bodies were removed daily. Others were left where they fell until work ended. The camp did not pause for the dead. It absorbed them and continued. Flossenbürg was not an accident of war. It was a deliberate structure, one that converted ideology into routine, cruelty into policy, and suffering into output. It proved that mass death did not require chaos. It required organization. And as Germany's military situation collapsed, this system did not soften. It tightened. What followed would be its most frantic, most lethal phase. A final descent where evacuation, concealment, and chaos would claim tens of thousands more lives. The machine was breaking down, but it would not stop killing on its own. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Expansion of Terror. Flossenbürg and the Nazi War Economy. By the early 1940s, Flossenbürg was no longer simply a concentration camp built around a stone quarry. It had become something far more dangerous, a vital component of the Nazi war economy. As Germany's war expanded across Europe, so did its demand for weapons, machinery, infrastructure, and labor. When free labor began to disappear into the front lines, the regime turned fully toward forced labor. Camps like Flossenbürg were no longer peripheral. They were essential. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, through contracts, inspections, memoranda, and meetings held far from the barracks and roll call yards. On paper, it looked efficient. In reality, it was catastrophic. The SS, which controlled the camp system, recognized that prisoners could be exploited far beyond quarry work. Granite alone could not sustain the demands of a total war. Germany needed armaments, aircraft parts, engines, ammunition, and underground factories safe from Allied bombing. The solution was simple and ruthless: move industry to the prisoners or move the prisoners to the industry. Flossenbürg became the administrative center of a rapidly expanding subcamp network spread across Bavaria, Saxony, and occupied territories. These satellite camps were built near factories, mines, construction sites, and weapons plants. Some held a few hundred prisoners. Others held thousands. All were governed by the same principles: maximum output, minimal survival. Major German companies entered into agreements with the SS. Firms such as Messerschmitt, Siemens, Dest, and others relied directly on concentration camp labor. Contracts specified the number of prisoners needed, the type of work required, and the cost per prisoner per day, paid not to the workers but to the SS. Human beings became line items. Prisoners were transported daily or relocated permanently to these subcamps. They worked assembling aircraft fuselages, machining engine components, producing ammunition, digging tunnels, and constructing fortified positions. Work shifts stretched 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. Breaks were rare. Mistakes were punished. As Allied bombing intensified, underground production became a priority. Prisoners were forced into mountainsides, carving tunnels with primitive tools, often without ventilation. Dust filled their lungs. Explosives shook unstable ceilings. Cave-ins were common. Those trapped inside were rarely rescued. Conditions in the subcamps were often worse than in Flossenbürg itself. Barracks were makeshift barns, factories, abandoned buildings. Sanitation was non-existent. Food rations were even smaller. Medical care was nearly absent. Guards were frequently more brutal, knowing fewer witnesses would ever see what happened. Prisoners assigned to industrial labor faced a cruel paradox. Productivity could mean survival, but it also meant being worked harder. Those who performed well were kept alive just long enough to break further. Those who failed were beaten, replaced, or sent back to the main camp to die. The Nazi system framed this exploitation as rational and necessary. Internal reports spoke of labor deployment, efficiency, and output quotas. Deaths were recorded as natural losses. The language was sterile. The reality was mass murder by attrition. Flossenbürg's population changed as a result. New transports arrived constantly. Resistance fighters from France, Belgium, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Soviet prisoners of war, Jews deported from ghettos and occupied regions. Political prisoners from within Germany itself. The camp became multinational, multilingual, and uniformly disposable. The SS exploited divisions among prisoners to maintain control. Nationalities were separated. Privileges were unevenly distributed. Capos, prisoner functionaries, were selected to enforce discipline, sometimes brutally, sometimes reluctantly. The system encouraged prisoners to police one another, fracturing solidarity. Yet, even within this industrialized terror, cracks appeared. Sabotage increased as prisoners realized the war was turning. Aircraft parts were filed incorrectly. Ammunition was damaged. Machines were slowed. These acts were dangerous and often fatal when discovered, but they spread quietly across the network. The SS responded with intensified surveillance and punishment. Public beatings increased. Executions were staged as warnings. Entire work details could be punished for the actions of one. Fear became the lubricant that kept production moving. By 1943 and 1944, Flossenbürg and its subcamps were operating at full capacity. Not because they were efficient, but because the regime was desperate. Prisoners were consumed faster than they could be replaced. Mortality soared, but the SS calculated that it was still cheaper to work prisoners to death than to protect their health. The camp had completed its transformation. It was no longer merely a site of confinement. It was a factory of suffering integrated into Germany's war machine, a place where death was not the goal, but the byproduct of relentless extraction. And as the war moved closer to Germany's borders, the pressure would only increase. The system had been built to exploit endlessly. It did not know how to stop. What followed would be the most chaotic and lethal phase yet, when the collapsing Reich attempted to keep its factories running while preparing to erase the evidence of what it had done. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Work as Punishment. Daily life inside the Flossenbürg labor system. By the time Flossenbürg reached the height of its expansion, work was no longer simply an obligation imposed on prisoners. It had become the camp's primary instrument of punishment, control, and destruction. Every aspect of daily life revolved around labor. When it began, how long it lasted, who survived it, and who did not. In Flossenbürg, work was not a path to survival. It was the mechanism through which survival was denied. Each day began before dawn. Prisoners were dragged from overcrowded barracks by shouting guards and the sharp blows of rifle butts. Sleep, already shallow and brief, was broken abruptly. Roll call followed, appel, where thousands stood motionless in freezing cold or driving rain for hours at a time. Sick prisoners collapsed. Dead bodies were propped upright to avoid punishment for missing numbers. Accuracy mattered more than life. Only after roll call did the workday truly begin. Prisoners were marched in columns toward their assigned labor sites. Quarries, construction zones, factories, tunnel entrances, rail lines, and workshops. Guards lined the routes, shouting, beating, and enforcing speed. Falling out of line invited immediate violence. A stumble could result in a beating severe enough to ensure the prisoner never stood again. The work itself was intentionally brutal. In the granite quarry, prisoners hauled massive stone blocks with minimal tools. Blasting dust coated their lungs. Cuts went untreated. Fingers were crushed. Those who slowed were beaten or kicked into pits. The quarry was not simply dangerous. It was designed to exhaust men beyond recovery. In industrial subcamps, conditions were no better. Prisoners stood for endless hours at machines, assembling aircraft parts or munitions under constant supervision. Errors were punished harshly. Guards did not care whether mistakes were caused by exhaustion, malnutrition, or trembling hands. Discipline was enforced through pain. Food rations bore no relation to caloric needs. A watery soup, a scrap of bread, occasionally a thin slice of sausage. This was all that sustained men working 12 to 16 hours a day. Hunger was constant, overwhelming, and deliberately maintained. Starvation was not a failure of supply. It was policy. Medical care existed in name only. The camp infirmary was overcrowded and under-equipped. Prisoners sent there were often those no longer considered useful. Some were selected for medical experiments. Others were simply left to die. Recovery meant returning to work. Death meant removal. Punishments were woven seamlessly into the labor system. Prisoners accused of sabotage, slowness, theft, or disobedience were assigned to the hardest details. Quarry hauling, snow clearing in winter, night shifts without rest. Others were beaten publicly, tied to posts, or executed in front of their work units as warnings. Kapos, prisoner overseers, played a central role. Some enforced discipline with extreme brutality, driven by fear or privilege. Others tried quietly to protect weaker prisoners when possible. But the system forced all into moral compromise. Refusal meant replacement, often by someone worse. Work also became a method of selection. Those deemed too weak were reassigned, sent back to the main camp or transported elsewhere, often to camps where survival rates were even lower. Productivity determined temporary survival. Weakness was criminalized. Despite this, prisoners developed fragile strategies to endure. Men shared crumbs of bread. They rotated burdens. Skilled workers tried to shield the sick by taking their place when guards looked away. Resistance was rarely open. It lived in small, dangerous acts. Slowing production, misaligning parts, hiding tools, preserving another day of life. Time itself lost meaning. Days blurred into one another, defined only by roll calls and exhaustion. Seasons passed unnoticed except through changes in temperature and mortality. Winter increased deaths through exposure. Summer brought disease and dehydration. The SS understood exactly what they were doing. Internal documents described prisoners as labor material. Losses were calculated and accepted. Replacement transports were scheduled accordingly. Human beings were consumed at a predictable rate. What made Flossenbürg distinct was not the presence of forced labor that existed across the Nazi camp system, but the way labor dominated every moment of existence. There was no refuge from it.
No pause. No neutrality.
To live was to work. To stop working was to die. By mid-war, this system had reached its most efficient cruelty. The camp no longer relied on overt executions alone. Death occurred through routine, through repetition, through a daily rhythm that broke bodies quietly and relentlessly. And yet, the system was beginning to strain. Allied bombings disrupted factories. Supplies grew scarce. Guards became more violent. Prisoners sensed change. Not hope, but instability. The labor machine was still running, but it was grinding itself apart. The closer Germany moved toward defeat, the more merciless Flossenbürg became. Work demands increased even as bodies failed faster. The system could not adapt. It only intensified. What awaited next was not reform but collapse, and with it the most chaotic and lethal phase of the camp's existence. Chapter 4, Segment 3. From Labor to Liquidation. When work could no longer hide death. By the final years of the war, the labor system at Flossenbürg had crossed a threshold where even its original purpose began to collapse. What had once been framed, even within Nazi bureaucracy, as productive exploitation no longer produced results. Prisoners were arriving already weakened from other camps, ghettos, and death marches. Supplies were failing. Allied bombing disrupted factories. And yet the camp did not slow. Instead, it transformed labor from a means of extraction into a final stage before elimination. By 1944, Flossenbürg was drowning in human beings. Transports arrived faster than prisoners could be processed, assigned, or even registered. Barracks overflowed. Men slept in shifts or stood through the night because there was no space to lie down. Sanitation collapsed entirely. Latrines overflowed. Lice spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis tore through the population. Still, every morning, prisoners were marched to work. At this stage, labor had become a filter rather than a function. Those who could still move were driven into factories and quarries. Those who could not were marked quietly, bureaucratically, for removal. Selection no longer required formal lists or medical examinations. A man who collapsed at roll call was dragged away. A worker who slowed too much was reassigned once, then disappeared. Entire work details were thinned out without explanation. The SS no longer hid the reality. Guards spoke openly about prisoners being used up. Capos were instructed to drive men harder, not because output mattered, but because exhaustion accelerated death. Starvation rations were reduced further. Soup grew thinner. Bread rations shrank. Hunger became unbearable. Men ate grass, leather scraps, sawdust. Some chewed paper simply to feel something in their mouths. Workdays grew longer as nights grew shorter. There was no recovery time, no medical relief. The infirmary had become a holding area for the dying. Beds were shared by the living and the dead. Corpses were stacked outside barracks because the crematorium could no longer keep up. Smoke hung permanently over the camp. Executions increased, but they were rarely announced. Prisoners vanished between work assignments. Trucks left the camp at night. Gunshots were heard beyond the perimeter. Some prisoners were hanged publicly as warnings. Others were killed out of sight. Death had become routine, no longer theatrical, no longer shocking. The labor system now served a final purpose: concealment. As long as prisoners were working, the camp could claim function. Reports continued to list output figures, even as bodies collapsed beside machines. The illusion of productivity masked the reality of mass death. Subcamps multiplied rapidly during this phase. Flossenbürg became the center of a vast network of satellite camps supplying labor to armaments factories across southern Germany and occupied territories. Prisoners were transported repeatedly, weakening them further. Many died en route. Others arrived only to be worked until they collapsed again. Fear inside the camp shifted. Earlier, prisoners feared punishment. Now they feared disappearance. Rumors spread of camps being evacuated, of prisoners being marched west, of executions meant to erase witnesses. No one knew who would survive the next week or the next day. Resistance, fragile but persistent, took new forms. Sabotage increased as prisoners realized survival was unlikely. Parts were deliberately misaligned. Tools were damaged. Production slowed. It was dangerous, but at this stage, death felt inevitable regardless. Acts of defiance became acts of dignity. Some prisoners began documenting what they could. Names, numbers, events, committing them to memory in hopes someone would live to tell the story. Others focused on preserving each other. Bread was shared even when it meant certain starvation. The idea of survival expanded beyond the individual. To keep another alive for one more day became a form of victory. By early 1945, the camp was in open crisis. Supplies had collapsed. Guards were increasingly violent, unpredictable, and afraid. Orders from Berlin became contradictory. Evacuation plans were discussed, delayed, rewritten. Prisoners sensed that something catastrophic was approaching. Labor continued until the very end. Even as artillery echoed in the distance, prisoners were forced into factories. Even as guards prepared to flee, roll calls continued. The system could not imagine stopping. It only knew how to consume. When work finally ceased, it was not because prisoners were freed. It was because the system itself was breaking apart. What followed would be the deadliest phase of all. Evacuation, marches, abandonment, and the final attempt to erase Flossenbürg and everyone inside it from history. The labor camp had fulfilled its purpose. The survivors were now liabilities. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Subcamp Empire. How Flossenbürg spread across the Reich. By 1943, Flossenbürg was no longer a single camp hidden in the Bavarian forest. It had become the center of a rapidly expanding labor empire, a web of satellite camps stretching across southern Germany, Bohemia, and occupied territories, all feeding the Reich's desperate war economy. What began as forced labor in a granite quarry evolved into an industrial system designed to squeeze every remaining ounce of strength from prisoners before discarding them. As Allied bombing intensified and Germany's manpower collapsed, the Nazi leadership turned increasingly to concentration camp labor to keep factories running. Armaments production was dispersed away from cities into forests, mountains, and underground facilities. Each new factory needed workers who could not strike, protest, or leave. Flossenbürg supplied them. Orders came from Berlin and from private companies alike. Messerschmitt, BMW, Siemens, Junkers, construction firms, quarry operators, weapons manufacturers. Camp administrators negotiated quotas of human beings the same way materials were ordered, by number, skill, and expected lifespan. Prisoners were assigned not based on survival, but on how long they could be worked before death. Subcamps multiplied at a terrifying pace. By late 1944, Flossenbürg controlled more than 90 satellite camps. Some held a few dozen prisoners. Others held thousands. Many were nothing more than fenced factory yards, converted barns, abandoned schools, or hastily built wooden barracks beside production sites. Conditions were often worse than in the main camp. Transportation between camps became routine. Prisoners were loaded onto trucks or marched long distances with no food or rest. Many died before arrival. Those who survived entered a new cycle of labor, brutality, and starvation. Transfers were not promotions or relief. They were resets designed to break the body again. Work inside the subcamps was relentless. Prisoners produced aircraft parts, ammunition, engines, electrical components, and construction materials. Shifts ran 12 to 16 hours. Accidents were common and fatal. Safety equipment did not exist. Injured workers were replaced, not treated. A crushed hand or broken leg meant death, either through neglect or execution. Food rations in the subcamps were even smaller than at Flossenbürg. Guards justified this by claiming transportation difficulties. In reality, starvation was policy. Prisoners were expected to survive just long enough to meet production targets. Once exhausted, they were returned to the main camp or sent onward, often to die. Discipline was enforced through terror. Capos were chosen for brutality. Beatings were public and constant. Roll calls lasted hours in freezing weather. Escape attempts were punished collectively. Entire barracks were denied food if one prisoner was suspected of sabotage. Fear was the glue that held the system together. Medical care did not exist. Sick prisoners worked until collapse. Those who could not stand were dragged away. Many subcamps lacked crematoria. Bodies were buried in shallow graves or burned in open pits. The smell of death became constant. What made the subcamp system especially lethal was its invisibility. Many were located near civilian towns. Local residents saw prisoners march to factories daily. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms. Yet production continued, contracts were fulfilled, and profits were made. The camp system had fused with ordinary industry. Flossenbürg's administration tracked everything. Numbers of prisoners, output quotas, mortality rates. Reports described deaths as losses or natural decline. Paperwork flowed smoothly even as human beings disappeared. The bureaucracy functioned perfectly. Inside the prisoner population, awareness grew that survival chances were shrinking. Veterans of the camp understood that transfers often meant death. Some tried to hide injuries. Others sabotaged work deliberately, accepting the risk. Resistance networks spread information quietly, warning newcomers what to expect. Despite everything, moments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared scraps of bread. Skilled workers shielded weaker ones by rotating tasks. Some capos, themselves prisoners, secretly slowed work or falsified numbers. These acts were small, dangerous, and often fatal, but they kept a sense of dignity alive. By early 1945, the subcamp empire was collapsing under its own weight. Supply lines failed. Factories were bombed. Guards deserted. Prisoners were marched from one camp to another with no destination. Human cargo in a system that no longer knew where to send them. Flossenbürg had become a hub of exhaustion, fear, and movement. A place where no one stayed long enough to recover, but long enough to die. The labor empire had achieved its goal. It had extracted value until nothing remained. What followed would be the final phase, when the system, no longer able to exploit, turned to erasure. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Exhaustion as Policy. How work became a method of killing. By the time Flossenbürg's subcamp network reached its peak, forced labor was no longer simply a tool of exploitation. It had become a calibrated system of destruction. Every detail, from work assignments to food rations, from shift length to punishment, was designed around a single assumption: the prisoner was disposable. Survival was never the objective. Output was. Inside both the main camp and its satellites, labor followed a brutal logic. Prisoners were categorized by perceived strength, skill, and remaining usefulness. Skilled machinists, engineers, electricians, and stonecutters were assigned to armaments production or precision work. The rest were sent to the hardest tasks available: quarrying stone, hauling materials, digging tunnels, clearing rubble, or constructing new facilities under impossible conditions. These were not temporary assignments. They were death sentences measured in weeks or months. Workdays began before dawn. Prisoners were woken violently, often after only a few hours of sleep on wooden planks shared by several men. Roll call followed, sometimes lasting hours in freezing rain or snow. Only then did the march to labor sites begin. Anyone who stumbled risked being beaten or shot. By the time work started, many were already exhausted. Shifts routinely lasted 12 to 16 hours. Breaks were rare and brief. Food consisted of thin soup and a small piece of bread, insufficient to replace even a fraction of the calories burned. Weight loss was rapid and visible. Men who had arrived strong were reduced to skeletal forms within weeks. Muscles wasted, vision blurred, immune systems collapsed. The SS understood this perfectly. Camp records tracked average productivity alongside mortality. When output declined, administrators did not improve conditions, they replaced workers. Transports arrived continuously to feed the machine. New prisoners took the place of the dead without interruption. The system was designed to never slow down. In the quarries, prisoners carried heavy stone blocks up steep paths under constant surveillance. Falls were frequent. A single stumble could pull others down with you. Guards often used these moments as opportunities for punishment, beating fallen men while forcing others to continue working around them. Bodies were removed only when work resumed. In factories, precision did not save lives. Machinery was dangerous. Exhaustion led to accidents. Missing fingers, crushed limbs, and fatal injuries were common. Injured prisoners were not treated. Those unable to work were selected out, often sent back to Flossenbürg or to extermination camps if transportation was available. More often, they simply disappeared. Punishment was woven directly into labor. Failure to meet quotas meant beatings. Suspected sabotage meant execution. Even accidental errors were treated as crimes. Prisoners learned quickly that survival depended not on obedience alone, but on appearing endlessly capable in a body that was already failing. Psychological terror was constant. Guards used unpredictability as a weapon. A man might be beaten one day and ignored the next, never knowing why. This uncertainty broke resistance more effectively than routine violence. Prisoners learned to live in a state of constant fear, conserving energy not just for work, but for anticipation of pain. Medical care existed only on paper. Camp doctors prioritized labor output, not health. Those deemed unfit were removed from work details and placed in so-called infirmaries where death came quickly through neglect, starvation, or lethal injections. Illness became another reason for elimination. Even children were not spared. Teenage prisoners were assigned adult labor tasks. Their smaller bodies collapsed faster. Their deaths were recorded without comment. In the camp's logic, age did not matter, only usefulness. What made Flossenbürg's labor system particularly lethal was its integration with the civilian economy. German companies relied on prisoner labor and monitored production closely. Managers visited sites. Complaints were filed when output fell. Requests were made for healthier workers. The camps responded by adjusting selections, not by improving conditions, but by accelerating replacements. The line between murder and labor dissolved completely. Work itself became the killing method. There were no gas chambers required to achieve mass death. Starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and violence accomplished the same end more quietly. Among prisoners, a grim understanding took hold. Survival depended on impossible calculations. Conserve energy without appearing lazy, avoid injury without slowing down, share food without starving, resist without being seen. Each day became a negotiation with death. Yet even here, humanity did not vanish entirely. Prisoners whispered warnings. Experienced workers protected newcomers when possible. Small acts, a hidden crust of bread, a brief rest, a falsified report, became lifelines. These gestures did not dismantle the system, but they challenged its purpose. By late 1944, as Germany's defeat loomed, the labor system intensified rather than eased. The SS pushed prisoners harder, knowing time was short. Death rates soared. Bodies piled up faster than they could be removed. Camps became places of constant collapse. Flossenbürg had perfected a model where killing required no explicit order. The system did the work on its own. And as the war entered its final months, that system would begin to unravel, not with mercy, but with chaos. Chapter 5, Segment 3. When the body fails, selection, disposal, and the final stage of labor-death. At Flossenbürg, forced labor did not end when a prisoner collapsed. Collapse was only the beginning of the final phase. Once a body could no longer meet the demands of work, the system moved swiftly to remove it, not out of efficiency alone, but to maintain the illusion that the camp still functioned. Prisoners who faltered were watched closely. Guards, capos, and SS overseers learned to recognize the signs. Slowed movements, trembling hands, shallow breathing, vacant eyes. A man who lagged behind for too long was marked. He might not know it yet, but his time had been measured. Sometimes the selection was immediate. A guard would pull a weakened prisoner from a work column and beat him until he could no longer stand. If he rose again, he was sent back to work. If he did not, he was removed. Other times, selections happened quietly during roll call. Names were called. Those who stepped forward were told they were being reassigned, hospitalized, or transferred. Few returned. The so-called infirmary was not a place of healing. It was a waiting room for death. Prisoners brought there were often stripped of what little food or clothing they had. Medical staff, themselves operating under SS orders, provided minimal care, if any. Lice-infested bunks, untreated wounds, and rampant disease ensured that most patients died within days. Those who lingered too long were cleared. Lethal injections, starvation, exposure, or transfer to extermination camps completed the process. Death certificates, when issued at all, listed causes such as heart failure, pneumonia, or exhaustion, clinical language masking deliberate murder. The system functioned with chilling calm. No single moment marked the transition from labor to death. It happened gradually, invisibly, as strength faded and usefulness declined. This was not chaos. It was planned attrition. Executions were sometimes public. Prisoners suspected of sabotage, resistance, or simply being an example were hanged or shot in front of work details. The purpose was clear: to remind everyone that falling behind was not only dangerous, it was fatal. Starvation accelerated everything. Rations were calculated to keep prisoners barely alive, never strong. Even when work quotas increased, food did not. Men consumed thousands of calories daily through labor while receiving only a fraction in return. Bodies cannibalized themselves. Organs failed. Minds clouded. By late 1944, Flossenbürg's population was swollen with evacuated prisoners from camps closer to the front. Barracks overflowed. Sanitation collapsed. Typhus spread uncontrollably. The SS did not respond by reducing labor demands. They responded by increasing pressure. Work details grew larger. Shifts grew longer. Punishments grew harsher. The camp became a place where death was no longer the exception. It was the expected outcome. Prisoners began to understand the pattern. A man who survived quarry work for 3 months was considered lucky. 6 months was extraordinary. A year was almost unheard of. Survival became a matter of timing as much as strength. Arriving at the wrong moment meant immediate exhaustion in a system already overloaded. Yet even at this stage, resistance did not disappear. It changed shape. Sabotage became quieter. Tools were damaged subtly. Measurements were altered. Production slowed just enough to matter, but not enough to trigger immediate retaliation. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery meant death. Solidarity, too, evolved. Experienced prisoners taught newcomers how to appear productive while conserving energy. They warned them when selections were coming. They shared strategies for standing upright during roll call, for hiding injuries, for saving crumbs of bread for the worst moments. But no strategy could defeat the system entirely. For every man who survived, many more did not. Flossenbürg's labor regime was designed around replacement, not endurance. Death was anticipated, planned for, and administratively absorbed. As Allied forces drew closer, the SS began preparing to erase evidence. Records were destroyed. Prisoners were transferred or marched out. Those too weak to move were often killed on the spot. The system, having consumed its victims, now sought to consume its own traces. In these final months, the distinction between labor camp and death camp vanished completely. Work continued even as bodies accumulated. Prisoners stepped over the dead to reach their tasks. Death became background noise, constant, expected, unremarked. When liberation finally came, it revealed what the labor system had produced. Thousands of skeletal survivors, mass graves, unfinished work sites littered with corpses, and a camp infrastructure built not to house life, but to extract it until nothing remained. Flossenbürg had proven something terrifyingly simple. You did not need gas chambers to annihilate human beings. You only needed time, hunger, discipline, and the belief that labor justified everything. And with that belief, an entire system had killed silently, efficiently, and relentlessly, one exhausted body at a time. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Invisible Network. Flossenbürg and the Expansion of Slave Labor. By the time Flossenbürg reached its most lethal phase, it was no longer a single camp operating in isolation. It had become the center of a sprawling forced labor network, silently embedded into the German war economy. What began as one quarry camp in a remote corner of Bavaria evolved into a system of dozens of satellite camps, each designed to extract the last remaining strength from prisoners in service of the Reich's collapsing ambitions. This expansion did not happen by accident. As the war intensified and Germany faced labor shortages, the SS recognized that camps like Flossenbürg could serve a dual purpose: punishment and production. Human beings became raw material, allocated not according to skill or survival, but according to how much could be consumed before death. New subcamps began appearing near factories, construction sites, weapons plants, and underground facilities. Some were little more than fenced barracks beside industrial buildings. Others were carved into forests, hillsides, or abandoned villages. All were connected by the same logic. Prisoners would live as close as possible to their work sites to maximize output and minimize concern for their health. Men were transported out from Flossenbürg in overloaded trucks or marched long distances, often without knowing where they were going. Those who arrived at subcamps encountered conditions that were frequently worse than the main camp. There were fewer witnesses, fewer inspections, and even less restraint on brutality. At these sites, prisoners manufactured aircraft parts, weapons components, ammunition, and military infrastructure. Others dug tunnels, repaired rail lines, built roads, or worked in armaments factories owned by private German companies that eagerly exploited this free labor. Contracts were signed. Production quotas were established. The SS was paid per prisoner per day. In this system, death was accounted for. When prisoners died, replacements were requested. The paperwork continued uninterrupted. Guards at subcamps were often younger, less experienced, and more violent. They ruled through fear and improvisation. Punishments varied by location, but the goal was always the same: enforce compliance without expending resources. Beatings were routine. Food was even scarcer than at Flossenbürg. Medical care was almost non-existent. The isolation of subcamps meant that prisoners disappeared more easily. A man who collapsed at a factory site might never be recorded as dead. His body could be buried nearby, burned, or returned to Flossenbürg weeks later as unidentifiable remains. The system absorbed him without trace. Women and children also entered this labor network as the war progressed. Entire transports were redirected from extermination camps not because the regime had become more humane, but because labor demands were desperate. Survival chances remained minimal. Exhaustion and starvation killed regardless of gender or age. Within Flossenbürg itself, administrative control expanded. The camp command tracked labor output obsessively while treating human life as an expendable variable. Prisoner hierarchies were adjusted to enforce discipline more efficiently. Capos were chosen not for leadership, but for cruelty and obedience. Resistance became harder as prisoners were scattered across dozens of locations. Communication between camps was dangerous and rare. Yet even within this fragmentation, solidarity did not vanish entirely. Prisoners shared information when transports crossed paths. They warned each other about deadly work sites. They passed whispered instructions on how to survive just a few days longer. By late 1944, the network was overstretched. Allied bombings disrupted production. Supply lines faltered. Food deliveries became erratic. But the SS did not reduce demands. Instead, they tightened control, pushing prisoners harder even as the system itself began to fracture. The result was catastrophic. Mortality rates soared across the Flossenbürg system. Subcamps became mass graves in all but name. Entire work details vanished within weeks. Yet reports continued to flow upward, sanitizing reality with statistics and euphemisms. This was the final evolution of Flossenbürg's purpose. It was no longer simply a camp where people were worked to death. It was a central node in a nationwide machine that consumed human lives to delay defeat by mere weeks or months. When historians later examined records from these sites, a pattern emerged. Productivity rose briefly, then collapsed as workers died faster than they could be replaced. The system destroyed itself along with its victims. But for those trapped inside it, this collapse brought no relief. It only meant longer hours, harsher punishment, and the constant threat of being sent somewhere worse. Flossenbürg had taught the Reich how to extract labor from suffering. Its subcamps taught the Reich how quickly that suffering could multiply. And as the war moved toward its end, this invisible network ensured that even far from the main camp's gates, the machinery of slow death continued, relentless, bureaucratic, and almost completely unseen. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Exhaustion as Policy. Daily life inside the subcamps. Inside the Flossenbürg subcamp system, daily life followed a rhythm designed not for efficiency alone, but for erosion. Each hour was structured to remove strength, clarity, and hope until survival itself became an act of defiance. Prisoners woke before dawn, often after only a few hours of restless sleep on bare wooden planks or damp straw. Roll calls began in darkness, with men standing motionless for long stretches in freezing rain or snow, counted and recounted while guards argued over numbers. Those who swayed or collapsed were dragged out of line, beaten, or left on the ground as a warning to others. Food was deliberately insufficient. Morning rations consisted of black liquid called coffee, often nothing more than warm water stained with grain. At midday, prisoners received a thin soup made from turnips, cabbage leaves, or spoiled vegetables, ladled unevenly and sometimes withheld entirely as punishment. Evening meals, when they arrived, offered a small piece of bread mixed with sawdust or potato peelings. Calories were calculated not to sustain labor, but to keep prisoners barely alive long enough to work again the next day. After roll call, work details marched out under guard. Some traveled miles on foot to factories, quarries, or construction sites. Others labored immediately beside the barracks, repairing bomb damage or hauling materials. There were no rest breaks. Tools were scarce and shared. Protective equipment did not exist. Injuries were common and untreated. A crushed hand, a torn muscle, a fractured leg, each meant the same thing. The prisoner would soon be considered useless. The work itself was relentless. In armaments factories, prisoners stood for 12 to 14 hours operating machinery they had never seen before, under constant threat of punishment for mistakes. In tunnel projects, they breathed dust and explosives fumes, digging deeper into the earth as Allied bombers forced production underground. In quarries and rail yards, they carried loads far beyond human capacity, stumbling over rubble and ice while guards screamed for speed. Exhaustion was not a side effect. It was the objective. The SS understood that fear alone could not sustain productivity. Hunger and fatigue weakened resistance, reduced escape attempts, and broke prisoners psychologically. A man who could no longer think clearly was easier to control. A body pushed beyond its limits would collapse without protest. Disease spread rapidly through these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia thrived in overcrowded barracks where washing was rare and clothing never dried. Lice infested seams and bedding. Medical care, when it existed at all, was a formality. Prisoner doctors lacked supplies and authority. Those deemed too sick were often sent back to Flossenbürg, or simply left to die where they lay. Punishment was constant and unpredictable. A missed quota, a broken tool, a glance in the wrong direction. Any of these could result in beatings, confinement, or execution. Public punishment served as theater. Prisoners were forced to watch as others were whipped, hanged, or shot. The message was clear. Obedience delayed death. Resistance hastened it. Yet within this system of calculated cruelty, human connections persisted. Prisoners shared fragments of food, whispered warnings, and helped each other stand during roll call to avoid selection. In factories, some sabotaged equipment in subtle ways, slowing production without detection. Others memorized names and dates, determined to bear witness if they survived. Night brought little relief. Barracks were overcrowded beyond design, bodies pressed together for warmth. Groans and coughing filled the darkness. Dreams were interrupted by alarms, searches, or the screams of those being taken away. Sleep was shallow and haunted, yet it remained essential, because dawn would bring the same demands again. As months passed, the distinction between main camp and subcamp blurred. Conditions deteriorated everywhere. Supplies dwindled. Guards grew more brutal as defeat loomed. Prisoners sensed the war's turning tide through rumors and distant explosions, but this knowledge offered no safety. In many subcamps, mortality increased as the SS attempted to extract maximum labor before retreating. By late 1944 and early 1945, entire work details vanished. Men were worked until they collapsed, then replaced by new transports arriving thinner and weaker than the last. The system fed on itself, consuming lives faster than it could replenish them. Still, production orders continued. Still, roll calls were held. Still, guards enforced rules that no longer served any purpose beyond cruelty. For those trapped inside the Flossenbürg labor network, time lost its meaning. Days blended together, measured only by hunger and pain. Survival depended on small calculations. Where to stand in line, how to conserve energy, whom to trust. Each decision carried life or death consequences. This was daily life inside the subcamps. Not chaos, but routine. Not madness, but administration. A system where exhaustion was policy, suffering was normalized, and death arrived quietly, one weakened body at a time. And as the Reich's defeat approached, this machinery did not slow. It accelerated, determined to extract every last ounce of labor before abandoning the people it had already condemned. Chapter 6, Segment 3. When labor failed, selection, disposal, and silent death. Inside the Flossenbürg system, labor was not endless. Every prisoner was measured against a single standard: usefulness. When the body could no longer meet that demand, the system responded with chilling efficiency. There was no retirement from work, no recovery period, no mercy. Exhaustion was tolerated only as long as it still produced output. Once a prisoner crossed the invisible line from exploitable to expendable, the machinery of disposal quietly took over. This transition rarely came with announcement. It began with subtle changes. A man stumbled more often. His hands shook while operating machinery. He failed to keep pace on the march to work. Guards noticed everything. Capos, prisoner overseers forced into collaboration, were expected to report weakness. In a world where survival depended on appearing strong, illness itself became a crime. Selections occurred constantly, not as single dramatic events but as routine administrative acts. During roll call, guards walked the lines, stopping to examine faces and bodies. Sunken cheeks, swollen legs, hollow eyes. These were signs of failure. Prisoners deemed unfit were pulled aside without explanation. Sometimes they were told they were being transferred to lighter work or medical care. Most knew better. Those removed from work details were often sent back to the main camp at Flossenbürg. The journey itself was deadly. Men already weakened were forced to march long distances or packed into transport trucks without food or water. Many died before arrival. Those who survived faced conditions even harsher than the subcamps they had left. The camp infirmary was not a place of healing. It was a waiting room for death. Beds were overcrowded, sheets were rarely changed, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Prisoner doctors were ordered to do nothing beyond basic triage. Serious illness meant one thing: removal from the labor pool. And removal from the labor pool meant elimination. Executions were often disguised as medical procedures or transfers. Some prisoners were injected with lethal substances under the pretense of treatment. Others were taken away in groups and shot, their deaths recorded as natural causes or work-related accidents. Documentation reduced human beings to numbers, causes of death simplified into bureaucratic language that concealed murder behind paperwork. As the war dragged on, the pace increased. By late 1944, Flossenbürg and its subcamps were overwhelmed by prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the advancing front. These new arrivals were already starved and traumatized. Many were incapable of labor from the moment they arrived. The system absorbed them anyway, briefly exploiting what little strength remained before discarding them. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be removed. Crematoria operated continuously, but fuel shortages and mechanical failures slowed the process. In some subcamps, corpses were stored in sheds or stacked outside barracks until transport became available. Prisoners were forced to carry the dead, sometimes their friends, sometimes family members, out of living spaces they would soon occupy again. Death lost its shock. It became part of the environment, as ordinary as mud or cold. Prisoners stepped over bodies on their way to roll call. Work continued beside the dying. Guards treated corpses with annoyance rather than horror, obstacles to be cleared so production could continue. Yet even in this phase of absolute dehumanization, resistance did not disappear. It adapted. Prisoners learned to conceal illness, binding swollen limbs, sharing scraps of food to keep one another standing just long enough to avoid selection. Some sabotaged machines when they knew they would not survive anyway, choosing disruption over obedience. Others memorized names, faces, dates, evidence stored in fragile human memory, waiting for liberation. Fear shaped every interaction. Trust was dangerous. A whispered complaint could be reported. A moment of weakness could mean death. Still, fragments of solidarity persisted. A hand under an arm during roll call, a shared breath during punishment. These acts did not overthrow the system, but they preserved something the system could not fully erase: human recognition. As Allied forces closed in during early 1945, logic collapsed but cruelty intensified. Orders came to evacuate camps, erase evidence, and prevent prisoners from being liberated alive. Those too weak to march were often executed on the spot. Columns of prisoners were driven out on death marches through snow and mud, collapsing along roadsides where mass graves quickly followed. In the sub-camps, chaos reigned. Guards abandoned posts. Others became more violent, killing indiscriminately. Production no longer mattered. Control did. The SS sought to maintain dominance even as defeat became inevitable. The system revealed its final truth. It had never been about victory alone. It was about power over life and death. When liberation finally came to Flossenbürg and its surviving subcamps, the living were barely distinguishable from the dead. Survivors weighed little more than children. Many died in the days and weeks after rescue, their bodies unable to recover from prolonged starvation and abuse. Liberation did not reverse what had already been done. For those who survived long enough to speak, the memory of labor never faded. It was not the hardest blows or the loudest screams that haunted them most. It was the routine, the schedules, the quotas, the way death arrived quietly, disguised as procedure. Flossenbürg did not rely on gas chambers to kill. It relied on systems, administrative, industrial, and human, that turned exhaustion into a death sentence. When labor failed, the system did not pause or reconsider. It simply moved on to the next body. This was the final function of forced labor. Not survival, not productivity, but elimination without spectacle. A slow disappearance carried out one weakened prisoner at a time, until silence replaced resistance and paperwork replaced memory. And that silence was exactly what the system was designed to leave behind. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Resistance in a world designed to break it. Flossenbürg was built to erase resistance. Every fence, every regulation, every punishment was calculated to isolate individuals, fracture trust, and crush the idea that collective action was possible. Fear was not a side effect of the camp system, it was its primary tool. And yet, even inside a place engineered to make resistance impossible, it did not disappear. It changed shape. It learned to survive in whispers, glances, and acts so small they often went unnoticed by the guards who believed they had already won. Resistance in Flossenbürg did not begin with weapons or uprisings. It began with memory. Prisoners arrived from across occupied Europe: communists, social democrats, resistance fighters, intellectuals, clergy, students, workers. Many had already fought the Nazi regime before their arrest. Others learned quickly that survival alone was not enough. To endure without surrendering one's identity became its own form of defiance. The SS understood the danger of organized prisoners. That is why political detainees were deliberately mixed with criminal prisoners, why nationalities were divided, why language barriers were exploited. Capos were often chosen from groups the SS believed would be most ruthless toward fellow inmates. Division was policy. Solidarity was a threat. Despite this, informal networks began to form almost immediately. Prisoners sought out others who shared a language, a trade, or a political background. At first, these connections were practical, sharing information about work details, warning each other of brutal guards, exchanging scraps of food. Over time, they became something more deliberate. Political prisoners, particularly German communists and socialists imprisoned early in the regime, played a central role. Many had experience in clandestine organization. They understood secrecy, compartmentalization, and discipline. Inside Flossenbürg, these skills were repurposed for survival. They created covert support systems that operated beneath the surface of daily camp life. Resistance often took the form of protection. Stronger prisoners shielded weaker ones during selections. Names were swapped on labor lists. Prisoners with access to administrative offices quietly altered records, changing a doomed assignment to a marginally safer one. A single mark on a document could mean the difference between life and death. Food was another battlefield. Rations were intentionally insufficient. Hunger dominated every thought. Still, prisoners pooled resources, sharing crumbs to keep someone alive one more day. Infirmary workers smuggled scraps to the sick. Kitchen workers risked severe punishment to divert soup thickened with peels or grain residue. These acts were small, but in a system designed to starve, they were radical. Information itself was resistance. News from the outside world was strictly forbidden. Radios were banned. Letters were censored or never delivered. Yet rumors circulated of Allied advances, of defeats on the Eastern Front, of cities liberated. Even uncertain news mattered. Hope, fragile as it was, became a resource to be guarded and shared carefully. In some subcamps, prisoners sabotaged production. Ammunition was deliberately damaged. Measurements were altered. Machines were misaligned just enough to reduce output without drawing immediate suspicion. These acts were dangerous. Discovery meant torture or execution. But for those involved, sabotage restored a sense of agency in a world that denied it at every turn. Cultural resistance also persisted. Prisoners recited poetry from memory, whispered prayers in secret, taught one another languages or mathematics during brief moments of rest. Children imprisoned in the camp, especially in later years, were sometimes hidden and protected by older prisoners who risked their lives to shield them from selections. Teaching a child to read or simply to survive another day became an act of defiance against a system that sought their disappearance. Women, though fewer in Flossenbürg itself compared to camps like Ravensbrück, were present in subcamps and transport routes. They, too, formed support networks, sharing strategies for endurance and mutual protection. Resistance was not confined to one gender, nationality, or ideology. It emerged wherever people refused to become exactly what the system demanded. Silent, isolated, and obedient, the SS responded with escalating brutality. Informants were encouraged. Collective punishments were imposed when resistance was suspected. Entire barracks were denied food or forced to stand for hours in freezing weather. Public executions were staged as warnings. The message was clear. Resistance would be punished not only individually, but collectively. Yet even this failed to fully extinguish it. The very cruelty of the system often radicalized prisoners further. Those who knew they were unlikely to survive sometimes chose open defiance in their final days, refusing orders, speaking forbidden words, or helping others escape punishment even at the cost of their own lives. As the war entered its final phase, resistance networks expanded their focus. With evacuation orders looming and death marches imminent, prisoners worked urgently to preserve evidence. Names were memorized. Atrocities were documented mentally when no paper was available. Survivors prepared themselves for testimony, understanding that survival carried responsibility. Some resistance members made contact with approaching Allied forces through escaped prisoners or civilians forced to work near the camps. These contacts were rare and perilous, but they contributed to the rapid collapse of SS control in the final days. When guards fled or abandoned posts, it was often organized prisoners who maintained order, prevented chaos, and protected the most vulnerable until liberation arrived. Resistance at Flossenbürg did not overthrow the camp. It did not stop the killings. It did not save most of those who entered its gates. But it achieved something else, something the SS never fully understood. It preserved humanity inside a system designed to annihilate it. In a place where the Nazis sought to reduce people to labor units and corpses, resistance insisted on identity, memory, and moral choice. It survived not through victory, but through persistence, through the refusal to forget who one was, even when everything else had been taken. This was resistance without banners or weapons. Quiet, fragmented, and fragile. But it endured long enough to carry the truth beyond the barbed wire. And in the end, that truth outlived the system that tried to bury it. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Cost of Defying the System. Resistance inside Flossenbürg never existed without consequence. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, carried the weight of lethal risk. The SS understood that resistance, even when quiet, threatened the foundations of their control. And so the camp responded with a system of punishment designed not only to discipline, but to terrorize, isolate, and erase those who dared to resist. Punishment in Flossenbürg was never spontaneous. It was methodical. The SS believed suffering had instructional value. Pain was meant to teach obedience, not just to the individual being punished, but to everyone forced to witness it. Every beating, every execution, every public humiliation served as a warning written onto human bodies. One of the most common punishments was the flogging. Prisoners accused of sabotage, theft, or insubordination were tied to a whipping bench and beaten with rods or leather straps, often in front of assembled inmates. Officially, the number of lashes was recorded 25, 50, sometimes more. Unofficially, guards frequently exceeded the count. Many prisoners did not survive the punishment itself. Others survived only to die days later from infection, internal injuries, or shock. Another tool of repression was solitary confinement. Prisoners were locked into narrow standing cells, sometimes barely wide enough to turn around. Food was withheld or reduced to starvation levels. Light was minimal or non-existent. Days blurred together. For some, this isolation was more destructive than physical violence. When released, prisoners were often broken, physically weakened, mentally disoriented, and marked as examples. Collective punishment was especially devastating. If sabotage was suspected within a work detail, the entire group could be punished. Barracks were forced to stand at attention for hours in freezing temperatures. Food rations were withheld. Random prisoners were selected for beatings or execution. This tactic was designed to turn prisoners against one another, to make resistance appear selfish, dangerous, and morally impossible. Informants were cultivated aggressively. The SS relied on prisoners, often criminals elevated to capo positions, to report suspicious behavior. Some did so out of cruelty, others out of fear. Refusing to cooperate could mean losing privileged positions or becoming targets themselves. The result was an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. A whispered conversation, a shared glance, an act of kindness could be misinterpreted or deliberately twisted into an accusation. Executions were the ultimate punishment, and they were never hidden. Hangings were conducted in the roll call square. Prisoners were forced to watch as fellow inmates were killed, sometimes after being made to stand for hours beside the gallows. The SS believed visibility amplified terror. Death, when public, became an instrument of control. Resistance leaders were especially targeted. Once identified, they were often transferred to punishment details known for extreme mortality: stone quarries, tunnel excavation, or transport labor under brutal conditions. These assignments were death sentences disguised as work orders. Survival was unlikely. The SS understood this and used it to remove perceived threats without overt executions. Medical abuse was another form of punishment. Prisoners accused of resistance could be sent to infirmaries not for treatment, but for experimentation or neglect. Being labeled unfit for work could result in selection for execution or transfer to extermination facilities. Health itself became a liability. Despite this, resistance did not stop. It adapted. Networks became more compartmentalized. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Sabotage became more subtle. Protection efforts focused on those most at risk: new arrivals, the sick, the elderly, children. Prisoners learned to read the behavior of guards, to predict inspections, to hide evidence in plain sight. The psychological toll of resistance was immense. Prisoners lived with constant fear, not only for themselves, but for others who might suffer because of their actions. Survivors later spoke of the moral burden, the question of whether an act of defiance that saved one person might condemn 10 others. There were no clear answers. Every choice existed within a system designed to punish compassion. Some prisoners reached a breaking point. Exhaustion, starvation, and terror pushed them toward despair. Others hardened, numbing themselves to survive. Resistance did not always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like stubborn endurance. Sometimes it looked like choosing to help one person instead of many. Sometimes it meant doing nothing because action would mean death. As the war progressed and conditions worsened, punishment intensified. The SS grew more brutal, more erratic. Executions increased. Records were falsified or destroyed. The line between discipline and chaos blurred. Guards, sensing the approaching collapse of the Reich, acted with increasing cruelty, as though punishment itself had become a form of denial. Yet even in these final stages, resistance persisted. Prisoners hid evidence. They memorized names, dates, locations. They prepared themselves to testify if they survived. Some smuggled documents out through civilian workers. Others ensured that mass graves were remembered, that execution sites were marked in memory even when erased physically. The cost of resistance was measured in lives. Many who resisted did not survive to see liberation. Their names are often missing from records, their actions known only through fragments of testimony. But without them, much of what is known about Flossenbürg would have been lost. The SS believed punishment would extinguish resistance. Instead, it revealed something they could not fully control. Even when resistance failed to change outcomes, it preserved meaning. It asserted that the system was not absolute, that human choice, however constrained, still existed. In Flossenbürg, resistance was not about victory. It was about refusal. Refusal to accept the camp's logic. Refusal to become only what the SS intended. Refusal to let terror have the final word. And for that refusal, countless prisoners paid with their bodies, their sanity, and their lives. But because of them, the truth survived. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Resistance as Survival, and the Quiet War Against Oblivion. By the later years of the war, resistance inside Flossenbürg no longer resembled organized defiance in any traditional sense. The camp had stripped prisoners of time, strength, and certainty. Yet resistance did not disappear. Transformed. It became quieter, slower, and more deeply woven into the daily struggle to stay alive. In Flossenbürg, survival itself became an act of resistance, a refusal to vanish as the system intended. As conditions worsened, the camp's population grew increasingly unstable. Transports arrived from evacuated camps in the east. Prisoners were transferred from Gross-Rosen, Auschwitz subcamps, and sites closer to the front lines. Barracks designed for a few hundred now held thousands. Food rations shrank further. Disease spread unchecked. Guards became more violent, less restrained, and more unpredictable. The SS no longer bothered to maintain the illusion of order. Death was constant and visible. In this environment, resistance was no longer about disruption alone. It was about preservation of life, of identity, of memory. Prisoners began to resist by protecting one another. Those who still had influence, capos who secretly opposed the SS, skilled workers, medical staff, used their positions to shield others from the worst labor details. A name could be erased from a transport list. A sick prisoner could be labeled temporarily useful to avoid execution. A child could be hidden among adults during roll calls. These acts were fragile and temporary, but they saved lives. Food sharing became one of the most dangerous forms of resistance. A piece of bread divided could mean survival for one person and death for another. Prisoners memorized the schedules of guards to pass food unnoticed. Some stole from kitchens at enormous risk. Others diluted soup less than ordered, knowing discovery could lead to execution. Hunger made generosity agonizing, but it did not eliminate it. Medical resistance continued under extreme constraints. Doctors and orderlies falsified diagnoses, hid prisoners during selections, and reused bandages despite infection risks. They treated illnesses with improvised remedies, boiled rags, crushed herbs, whispered advice. The infirmary, officially a place of neglect and death, became one of the last spaces where prisoners attempted to restore dignity to broken bodies. Resistance also took psychological forms. Prisoners told stories of home, of family, of places they might never see again. They recited poetry from memory. They taught children to read using scraps of paper. These acts were dangerous not because they disrupted labor, but because they reminded people that the camp was not the whole world. The SS sought to collapse identity into prisoner numbers. Memory pushed back. As the Reich began to crumble, another form of resistance emerged: preparation for testimony. Prisoners began memorizing names of guards, dates of executions, locations of mass graves, factory outputs, and camp routines. They knew records were being destroyed. They understood that survival alone would not be enough. Proof would be required. Some prisoners risked everything to preserve documents. Work details in administrative buildings smuggled scraps of paper. Civilians working in nearby factories were sometimes bribed or begged to carry messages. Even a single name written down mattered. The SS aimed not only to kill but to erase. Prisoners resisted by refusing to forget. By early 1945, Flossenbürg entered its final phase. Allied forces approached. Bombing intensified. Guards grew frantic. Orders arrived to evacuate prisoners westward. Death marches began. Thousands were forced to walk in freezing conditions, starving, sick, and barely clothed. Those who collapsed were shot. Roads became mass graves. Resistance during the marches was nearly impossible. Yet it occurred. Prisoners supported one another physically, lifting those who stumbled. Civilians sometimes threw food or water despite threats. Some prisoners escaped into forests. Others deliberately slowed their pace to avoid being separated from friends, knowing that isolation meant death. Inside the camp, those left behind faced chaos. Guards abandoned posts. Others became even more brutal. Executions increased. The structure of terror fractured, becoming unpredictable and more dangerous than ever. Yet even then, prisoners organized to maintain order among themselves, distributing food, calming panic, and preparing for liberation or annihilation, whichever came first. When American forces finally approached Flossenbürg in April 1945, resistance took one final form: survival long enough to be seen. Prisoners cleaned wounds as best they could. They gathered the weakest together. They prepared to speak. They knew that liberation did not automatically mean justice. Evidence would matter. The SS fled, leaving behind bodies, documents half-burned, machinery abandoned mid-operation. What remained were survivors, skeletal, diseased, traumatized, but alive. And within them lived the record of what the camp had been. After liberation, resistance continued in another form: testimony. Survivors gave statements. They identified guards. They returned to mass grave sites. They spoke of beatings, starvation, executions, and forced labor. Many collapsed or died shortly after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover, but not before telling what they knew. Flossenbürg did not become as widely known as Auschwitz or Dachau. This name faded more easily, but without the resistance of those who survived, those who remembered, recorded, and testified, it might have disappeared almost entirely. The SS believed that fear could extinguish resistance. What they did not anticipate was that resistance does not require hope of success. It requires only refusal to accept total erasure. In Flossenbürg, resistance was not loud. It did not overthrow the camp. It did not stop the killing. But it did something else. It preserved truth. And because of that, the camp did not win its final battle, the battle against memory. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The collapse of order and the beginning of the end. By the start of 1945, Flossenbürg no longer functioned as a camp governed by rules, schedules, or even the brutal logic that had sustained it for years. What replaced it was something more dangerous: collapse. The Nazi system that had built Flossenbürg with precision and intent was now breaking apart under the weight of defeat, panic, and desperation. Yet even as the Third Reich crumbled, the machinery of suffering inside the camp did not stop. It accelerated. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward. In the west, Allied armies crossed the Rhine and moved deeper into Germany. Camps across occupied Europe were being evacuated in haste. Prisoners were forced out of Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and dozens of smaller camps, driven westward in freezing weather, starving, sick, and often already dying. Flossenbürg became one of the destinations for these human remnants of a collapsing empire. Trainloads arrived almost daily. Boxcars packed beyond capacity rolled into the camp carrying prisoners who had already survived death marches, bombardments, and weeks without food. Many arrived dead. Others collapsed onto the platform, unable to stand. The SS made no attempt to provide shelter or care. The camp was already overcrowded beyond imagination, and now it simply absorbed the overflow of destruction. Barracks meant for a few hundred men were forced to contain thousands. Prisoners slept sitting up, pressed against one another for warmth. Sanitation systems collapsed completely. Latrines overflowed. Water was scarce. Lice spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through the camp with terrifying speed. The infirmary became a place of waiting, not for recovery, but for death. Food rations, already starvation level, were reduced further as supply lines broke down. The SS requisitioned what little remained for themselves. Prisoners survived on thin soup made from turnips or grass, scraps of bread weighed and divided with painful precision. Hunger hollowed bodies and minds alike. Men became skeletal, their faces unrecognizable even to those who had known them for years. At the same time, forced labor did not cease. In fact, it intensified. The Nazi war economy, even in its final collapse, demanded output. Prisoners were driven into factories, quarries, and underground installations with renewed cruelty. Those too weak to work were beaten, shot, or simply left to die. The concept of usefulness narrowed until almost no one qualified. SS discipline deteriorated. Guards were exhausted, frightened, and increasingly violent. Some drank heavily. Others lashed out randomly. Orders from Berlin became contradictory or impossible to execute. The clear hierarchy that once governed camp life dissolved into chaos. Punishments became arbitrary. Executions were carried out without documentation. Bodies were no longer carefully registered. They were piled, burned, or buried hastily. The crematorium could no longer keep up. Smoke drifted constantly over the camp. When fuel ran out, bodies were stacked outdoors. Mass graves were dug in frozen ground. Prisoners assigned to burial details worked silently, knowing they would soon be part of the same earth they were turning. Yet even in collapse, the SS remained committed to one final objective: erasure. Orders arrived to evacuate the camp as Allied forces approached. Prisoners were to be removed, marched westward, or killed if they could not move. Evidence was to be destroyed. Witnesses were to disappear. Death marches began in waves. Thousands were forced out of Flossenbürg and its subcamps, driven along roads through Bavaria and Bohemia. They marched without adequate clothing, food, or rest. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot. Villages along the routes became unwilling witnesses to mass murder in motion. Roadsides filled with bodies. Inside the camp, fear spread rapidly. Prisoners knew evacuation often meant death. Yet staying behind carried its own risks. Rumors circulated wildly of mass executions, of Allied bombings, of liberation just days away. No one knew which was true. Time lost its meaning. Each morning could be the last. The SS destroyed records, burned documents, and attempted to dismantle administrative offices. Guards packed personal belongings and prepared to flee. Some prisoners were forced to assist in destroying evidence, dismantling machines, cleaning bloodstains, burying bodies deeper. Others were locked into barracks and left without food as guards abandoned their posts. Despite the chaos, prisoners organized what they could. Informal committees formed to distribute remaining food. Stronger prisoners carried the weak. Doctors tried to prevent fatal refeeding when liberation seemed imminent. Resistance networks prepared to take control of the camp if guards fled suddenly, fearing that panic could lead to mass death. As April approached, the sound of artillery grew closer. Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Bombing shook the region. Guards became increasingly erratic. Some threatened mass shootings. Others simply vanished overnight. The camp existed in a terrifying limbo, abandoned but not yet free. Flossenbürg, built as a machine of control, now revealed its final form. A place where order collapsed into cruelty, and cruelty continued even without command. This was the end phase of the camp, not a release from suffering, but its most dangerous moment. Because when systems of terror fall apart, they do not become humane. They become unpredictable. And in Flossenbürg, unpredictability meant death. The camp was nearing its final days, but for thousands inside, survival still depended on enduring just a little longer, in a world where the rules had vanished, but the violence had not. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Death Marches and the Erasure of Witnesses. As the front lines crept closer in the spring of 1945, the SS reached a grim conclusion about Flossenbürg and its vast network of subcamps. The prisoners could not be allowed to fall into Allied hands, not because they were dangerous, but because they were witnesses. What followed was one of the final crimes of the Nazi camp system: the mass evacuation of human beings who were already half dead, driven into motion so that the truth might disappear with them. The order did not arrive with ceremony. It came in fragments: shouted commands, hastily written notices, whispered instructions passed down through collapsing chains of authority. Camp commanders were told to clear their camps. Guards were instructed to move prisoners westward or southward, away from advancing American forces. Those who could not march were not to be accommodated. They were to be eliminated. For the prisoners, evacuation meant one thing: the beginning of a death march. Columns were assembled with brutal speed. Men were dragged from barracks, many unable to stand on their own. Shoes were a luxury. Coats were rare. Food was almost non-existent. Prisoners were given a piece of bread, sometimes nothing at all, and told to move. Those who protested or hesitated were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot where they lay. The marches left Flossenbürg in multiple directions. Some columns moved toward Dachau, others toward the Austrian border. Still others were forced along rural roads through villages that had been largely untouched by the war. Civilians watched in silence as skeletal figures staggered past, guarded by armed SS men with orders to kill without hesitation. The pace was merciless. Prisoners marched for hours, sometimes days, without rest. At night, they slept in ditches, barns, or open fields. Rain soaked them. Cold nights stiffened joints already ruined by labor and starvation. Dysentery spread rapidly. Those too weak to keep up were dragged to the roadside and executed. Often the bodies were left where they fell, a trail of death marking the retreat of the Third Reich. SS discipline on the marches was inconsistent but always lethal. Some guards were rigid, following orders precisely. Others were panicked, firing wildly at any sign of delay. Alcohol was common. Fear made cruelty unpredictable. Prisoners never knew whether slowing down would earn a beating, a bullet, or both. In several cases, entire groups were massacred when guards believed escape was imminent or Allied forces were too close. Small forests, ravines, and abandoned quarries became impromptu execution sites. Graves were shallow or non-existent. The earth itself was pressed into service as a final layer of concealment. Inside Flossenbürg, those not immediately marched out faced a different terror. Prisoners who were sick, wounded, or simply deemed expendable were gathered separately. Some were locked into barracks without food or water. Others were shot in small groups under the pretense of transport preparation. The camp infirmary, already overwhelmed, became a place where death was simply observed. SS officers destroyed records obsessively. Names were burned. Transport lists were shredded. Camp files were reduced to ash. Guards dismantled signage, smashed equipment, and attempted to scrub evidence of executions. The goal was clear. When the Allies arrived, they were to find confusion, not clarity. Yet the system could not erase everything. Villagers remembered the marches. Farmers remembered bodies in their fields. Survivors remembered the faces of those who fell beside them. Even some guards would later testify, unable to fully bury what they had seen or done. As evacuations continued, Flossenbürg itself became strangely quieter. Barracks emptied. Roll calls grew shorter. Entire sections of the camp stood abandoned, littered with personal belongings. Shoes, bowls, blankets, photographs, left behind by those who had been forced onto the roads. The camp began to resemble a ghost structure, its function ending not with closure, but with abandonment. Meanwhile, prisoners who remained began to sense a shift. Guards disappeared overnight. Towers were left unmanned for hours at a time. Gunfire became sporadic. Some SS men fled in civilian clothing. Others attempted to blend in with retreating military units. Authority fractured completely. Prisoner resistance groups, long operating in secrecy, prepared for the worst. They feared a final massacre, a last-minute attempt to kill everyone left behind before fleeing. Lookouts were posted. Messages were passed quietly between barracks. Plans were made to seize control if necessary, though weapons were scarce and bodies were weak. The death marches continued until the very last days. Even as Allied troops closed in, prisoners were still being forced onto the roads. The regime was collapsing, but its commitment to destruction remained intact. These marches were not chaotic accidents of war. They were deliberate acts of erasure. The SS understood that the camps were evidence. The prisoners were proof, and proof had to be destroyed. By the time American forces neared Flossenbürg, Thousands who had once been imprisoned there were already dead. Not in the camp itself, but scattered across the countryside, unmarked and unnamed. Flossenbürg had begun as a place of forced labor. It would end as a starting point for one of the final mass crimes of the Holocaust. The camp was emptying. The roads were filling with bodies. And liberation, when it came, would arrive too late for many, but not too late to reveal what the Nazis had tried and failed to erase. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Liberation without relief. When American forces finally reached the outskirts of Flossenbürg in April of 1945, they did not encounter a battlefield. There were no entrenched defenses, no last stand by fanatical guards, no dramatic exchange of fire. What they found instead was something far more disturbing, a place that had already finished destroying itself. The camp stood largely silent. Watchtowers were empty. Barracks were half abandoned. Gates that had once sealed tens of thousands inside now hung open, unmanned. The SS had fled in layers. First the administrators, then most guards, and finally those who believed they could still disappear into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. What remained was not a functioning camp, but the aftermath of one. Inside the compound, American soldiers encountered prisoners who barely resembled human beings. Survivors were skeletal, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags that hung loosely from bodies stripped of muscle and fat. Many were too weak to stand. Some could not speak. Others stared blankly, unable to comprehend that the uniforms they saw were not another trick, another deception, another prelude to violence. Liberation did not arrive with cheers. It arrived with confusion, fear, and disbelief. Some prisoners hid when they saw the troops, convinced that this was yet another SS ruse. Others crawled forward on hands and knees, driven by instinct rather than understanding. A few collapsed and died within hours, bodies that had been pushed too far to recover, even when the system killing them finally stopped. American medics were overwhelmed immediately. Flossenbürg was not a camp of gas chambers and mass graves like those later uncovered in the East, but it was filled with the consequences of slow extermination. Starvation, untreated disease, infections that had spread unchecked for months, and internal organ failure caused by prolonged malnutrition and forced labor. Typhus loomed as a constant threat. Dysentery was widespread. Tuberculosis ravaged weakened lungs. Wounds festered from beatings and industrial accidents. Many prisoners could not digest normal food. When given standard rations, some died from refeeding syndrome, their bodies unable to process nourishment after months of deprivation. Liberators quickly realized that freeing the prisoners was only the beginning. Keeping them alive would require as much discipline and care as any military operation. Emergency hospitals were established. Quarantine zones were created. Survivors were fed cautiously, spoon by spoon. Clothing was disinfected. Bodies were washed, sometimes for the first time in months or years. As medical efforts continued, the evidence emerged. Bodies lay stacked near crematoria, some burned, others untouched. Barracks floors were slick with filth and decay. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Shoes without owners, bowls with names scratched into the metal, letters never sent. Execution sites were identified around the camp perimeter, marked by shallow pits and blood-stained ground. American officers ordered everything documented. Photographs were taken. Film cameras rolled. Testimonies were recorded as soon as survivors were able to speak. Soldiers wrote reports describing what they saw, often struggling to find words that did not feel inadequate. Many would later say that Flossenbürg changed them permanently, that no amount of training had prepared them for a place where suffering had been turned into routine. Outside the camp, the death marches came into focus. Local villagers led Allied units to roadsides and forests where bodies lay unburied. survivors of the marches began to arrive back at Flossenbürg in small groups. Men who had escaped into the woods, who had collapsed and been left for dead, who had been abandoned by guards fleeing faster than their prisoners could follow. Each return brought new testimony, new confirmation of what had happened beyond the barbed wire. The full scale of Flossenbürg's role in the Nazi system became clearer by the day. This was not an isolated site. It was the center of a vast labor network tied directly to the German war economy. Factories, quarries, and underground facilities across Bavaria and Bohemia had consumed human lives at a rate measured not in weeks, but in hours. Prisoners were replaced as quickly as tools. Death was factored into production. And now that system had collapsed, not with dignity, not with accountability, but with panic and abandonment. For the survivors, liberation did not erase trauma. Many had lost families whose fates they would not learn for years or ever. Some discovered that their homes no longer existed. Others had nowhere to return to at all. The camp had become their entire world, and freedom brought terrifying uncertainty. Yet even in these moments, acts of resistance continued, transformed now into acts of testimony. Former prisoners helped identify SS personnel. They pointed out execution sites. They translated camp records that had survived destruction. They told their stories repeatedly, even when doing so reopened wounds they had barely survived. Flossenbürg did not vanish after liberation. It became evidence. Within months, investigations began that would lead to war crimes trials. Former guards and administrators were arrested. Survivors were called to testify against men who had once held absolute power over their lives. The language of bureaucracy, so carefully used to conceal murder, was now turned against its creators. And yet, even as justice began, absence remained. Thousands who had passed through Flossenbürg were already dead, uncounted, erased by labor, starvation, execution, or the marches that followed. Their names were missing from records deliberately destroyed. Their graves were scattered across fields and forests, marked only by memory. Liberation came too late for them, but not too late for history. Flossenbürg had been built to extract labor until bodies failed. It had been emptied in an attempt to erase witnesses. And yet, the truth remained, carried by survivors, preserved by evidence, and sealed into the record of what happens when a state decides that human life can be measured only by usefulness. The camp no longer functioned, but its warning had only just begun. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Justice After Silence. The First Reckoning. When the gates of Flossenbürg finally stood open and the last prisoners were freed, the camp itself fell silent. But the story did not end there. In many ways, it was only beginning. The machinery of terror had collapsed, yet the question remained: what would be done with those who built it, operated it, and enforced it day after day? For years, Flossenbürg had existed in secrecy, hidden behind bureaucratic language and distant from the public eye. Now, in the aftermath of liberation, the world demanded answers and accountability. The American military authorities moved quickly. Unlike earlier moments in history when atrocities had been discovered and then quietly absorbed into the chaos of war, Flossenbürg was documented with intent. Investigators arrived while the evidence was still fresh. Survivors were still alive. Graves had not yet been disturbed. The physical layout of the camp still revealed how suffering had been organized. The goal was clear. This place would not be dismissed as an unfortunate consequence of war. It would be examined as a crime scene. Former SS personnel were hunted down across the region. Some had attempted to blend into civilian populations, discarding uniforms and claiming they were forced conscripts or clerks with no authority. Others insisted they had fled before the worst occurred. Many claimed ignorance, a defense that quickly collapsed when confronted with records, witness testimony, and the physical reality of the camp itself. Flossenbürg had not functioned through chaos. It had operated through order, schedules, quotas, and command structures. Someone had signed every order. Someone had enforced every punishment. Survivors played a central role in the early investigations. Despite exhaustion, illness, and trauma, they identified guards, capos, and administrators who had brutalized them. They described work details that functioned as death sentences. They explained how punishment blocks operated, how executions were disguised as discipline, how starvation was calibrated rather than accidental. Many testified multiple times, repeating their stories to translators, officers, and legal officials, knowing that memory was now the only weapon they had left. What emerged was a chilling realization. Flossenbürg had not required extraordinary monsters to operate. It required compliance. Guards followed orders. Supervisors enforced quotas. Clerks filed paperwork. Engineers calculated output. Each role appeared small in isolation, but together they formed a system capable of destroying tens of thousands of lives without ever declaring itself murderous. The first trials connected to Flossenbürg were held under U.S. military jurisdiction, part of a broader effort to prosecute crimes committed within liberated zones. These proceedings did not resemble dramatic public spectacles. They were methodical, restrained, and often emotionally unbearable. Evidence was presented in photographs, documents, and survivor testimony. Defendants sat silently as the consequences of their actions were read aloud. Names, dates, injuries, deaths. Many defendants insisted they had merely followed orders. The court rejected this argument. For the first time in history on such a scale, the principle was formally asserted that obedience to criminal orders did not absolve responsibility. The camp had not been an abstract idea. It had been a place where real people were beaten, starved, shot, and worked to death. Participation, whether direct or administrative, mattered. Sentences varied. Some received long prison terms. Others were executed. Not every perpetrator was found. Not every crime was punished. Files were incomplete. Witnesses had died. Records had been destroyed deliberately in the final weeks of the war. Justice, even when pursued, remained partial and imperfect. For survivors, the trials brought conflicting emotions. Some felt relief seeing their tormentors named and condemned. Others felt hollow, knowing that no sentence could restore what had been taken. Families erased, years stolen, bodies permanently damaged. Many struggled with the realization that some perpetrators would never be identified at all, having vanished into post-war anonymity. Outside the courtroom, another struggle unfolded: memory. As Europe began rebuilding, there was pressure to move forward, to forget, to frame the camps as aberrations rather than systems rooted in society itself. Flossenbürg, lacking the immediate notoriety of larger extermination camps, risked slipping into obscurity. Survivors understood this danger acutely. They had watched the SS attempt to erase evidence once before. They would not allow history to repeat that silence. Former prisoners organized associations. They collected testimonies. They pushed for memorials. They returned to the site, sometimes decades later, standing on ground that had nearly destroyed them, determined that it would not be reduced to rubble or rewritten as something harmless. Memory, they believed, was a form of justice when courts fell short. The German population faced its own reckoning. Nearby towns had supplied labor, materials, and services to the camp. Some residents claimed ignorance. Others admitted they had known, but said fear had kept them silent. The proximity of Flossenbürg shattered the myth that camps existed only in distant, unseen places. Terror had been woven into everyday life, visible to those who chose to see it, and ignored by those who chose not to. By the late 1940s, Flossenbürg had become more than a former camp. It had become a symbol of how forced labor functioned as a weapon, how ideology could transform work into extermination, and how ordinary systems could be repurposed for extraordinary cruelty. The trials marked the first attempt to confront that truth legally, even if they could never fully resolve it. Justice, in the end, arrived unevenly, but it arrived enough to leave a record stating that what happened at Flossenbürg was not an accident of war. It was a crime planned, executed, and enforced by human beings who made choices. And that record would stand as the foundation for everything that followed. Remembrance, education, and the warning that silence is never neutral. The camp had been built to erase lives. Its aftermath ensured those lives would speak. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Memory under pressure. Forgetting, denial, and the long struggle to remember. In the years after the first trials faded from headlines, Flossenbürg entered a far more uncertain phase, not of physical destruction, but of historical erasure. The war was over, Europe was exhausted, and a new conflict was already taking shape. As the Cold War hardened borders and loyalties, attention shifted rapidly from crimes of the past to fears of the future. In that transition, many former camps were left suspended in an uneasy silence. Flossenbürg was no exception. The physical site itself reflected this ambiguity. Barracks that had once confined thousands were repurposed or dismantled. Quarries resumed civilian use. Roads cut through former camp areas. For local communities struggling to rebuild, the camp was both an uncomfortable reminder and an obstacle to normal life. There was little appetite for prolonged reflection on a place associated with shame, complicity, and trauma. Silence, once enforced by terror, now returned through neglect. For survivors, this silence felt dangerously familiar. They had lived through a system designed to erase them, and now they watched as memory itself began to fade. Many found that speaking about Flossenbürg was met not with hostility, but with indifference. The public wanted simpler narratives, heroes and villains, liberation and victory, not complex stories about forced labor, bureaucratic cruelty, and societies that had looked away. The camp did not fit neatly into the emerging post-war identity of progress and recovery. At the same time, political pressures shaped remembrance in subtle ways. In divided Germany, narratives of the Nazi period were filtered through competing ideologies. Some emphasized resistance while minimizing collaboration. Others framed camps primarily as symbols of fascist oppression without fully confronting the social structures that had enabled them. Flossenbürg, a camp defined by labor exploitation and administrative terror, resisted easy categorization. Its story demanded uncomfortable questions about industry, obedience, and the normalization of violence. Former prisoners refused to let the site disappear quietly. Across borders and languages, survivor groups organized commemorations, published memoirs, and lobbied governments for recognition. Many returned to Flossenbürg despite the pain of revisiting a place tied to starvation, beatings, and loss. They walked paths where they had once marched under guard. They stood near execution sites that were now overgrown or unmarked. Each visit was an act of resistance against forgetting. Yet progress was slow. Memorialization required political will, funding, and public acknowledgement, all of which were uneven in the early decades after the war. For years, Flossenbürg remained overshadowed by larger camps that had become international symbols. Its victims were remembered privately, but not always publicly. School curricula mentioned the Holocaust in broad terms, but often passed quickly over camps like Flossenbürg, where death came through work rather than immediate extermination. As time passed, a new urgency emerged. Survivors were aging. Testimonies that had once been delivered in courtrooms were now being recorded for archives, museums, and future generations. Each death of a witness felt like the closing of a door. Those who remained understood that memory could not rely on living voices forever. It had to be anchored in institutions, education, and physical spaces that would endure. Gradually, Flossenbürg began to change again, this time deliberately. Sections of the camp were preserved rather than repurposed. Memorial markers replaced silence. Documentation centers were established to contextualize what had happened there, not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a larger system of forced labor and repression. The narrative expanded beyond numbers to include individual lives, choices, and consequences. This transformation did not come without resistance. Some locals feared renewed stigma. Others questioned why the past should continue to define the present. But these debates themselves revealed the camp's enduring relevance. Flossenbürg was not just a historical site. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting how easily suffering could be rationalized when wrapped in legality, productivity, and obedience. International attention slowly followed. Scholars examined Flossenbürg's role in the Nazi labor economy. Educators incorporated its history into broader discussions of human rights and state violence. Visitors arrived not only to mourn but to understand, to see how a camp built around work rather than immediate killing could still function as an instrument of mass death. What became clear was that remembrance is not a single act, but a continuous process. It requires renewal as contexts change and as new generations confront histories they did not experience personally. Flossenbürg's story had survived attempts at physical destruction by the SS, and later attempts at quiet forgetting by a world eager to move on. Its endurance was owed not to chance, but to sustained effort by those who refused silence. By the end of the 20th century, Flossenbürg stood recognized as a central example of how forced labor camps operated, not on the margins of the Nazi system, but at its core. The camp's legacy shifted from obscurity to warning. It demonstrated that mass suffering does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it unfolds through routine, schedules, and the steady erosion of dignity. Memory, in this sense, became the final battleground. And unlike the prisoners who once labored there, memory could not be beaten into submission, as long as someone was willing to carry it forward. Chapter 9, Segment 3. From Remembrance to Warning. Why Flossenbürg Still Matters. As the decades passed and Flossenbürg gradually emerged from obscurity, its meaning began to shift. What was once a place defined only by suffering and neglect became something else. A warning carved into landscape and memory. Not a warning delivered through spectacle or shock, but through structure. Flossenbürg mattered because it showed how terror could be organized calmly, legally, and efficiently, without chaos, without secrecy, and without resistance from the systems that surrounded it. Unlike camps built solely for immediate extermination, Flossenbürg revealed a more unsettling truth. Genocide did not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it unfolded slowly, disguised as labor, discipline, and economic necessity. Prisoners were not always murdered at once. They were consumed. Their bodies were treated as fuel, exhausted until collapse, replaced when broken, documented until death. This made Flossenbürg especially difficult to confront, because its logic mirrored modern systems far too closely. The camp operated through forms, schedules, quotas, and productivity reports. It relied on cooperation between SS officers, engineers, industrial planners, civilian contractors, and clerks. Violence was present, but it was not constant chaos. It was routine, predictable, institutional. That was the lesson survivors emphasized again and again. The most dangerous systems are not those driven by visible rage, but those that normalize cruelty through order. As memorialization matured, historians began to frame Flossenbürg not as an exception, but as a case study. Here was a camp where ideology met industry, where punishment merged with profit, where the language of efficiency erased the language of humanity. Understanding Flossenbürg meant understanding how ordinary structures, work assignments, housing arrangements, medical oversight, could be turned into mechanisms of destruction when stripped of moral limits. Educational programs increasingly focused on these dynamics. Visitors were not only shown where prisoners slept or died, but how decisions were made, who signed orders, who calculated output, who benefited. The story expanded outward beyond the barbed wire into factories, ministries, and boardrooms. Flossenbürg forced an uncomfortable realization. The camp did not exist in isolation. It was supported by a society that accepted its function. For younger generations, this reframing was critical. Few were seeking to understand Nazism as an ideology alone. They wanted to know how it worked, how it spread, how it became normal. Flossenbürg provided answers that were deeply unsettling precisely because they were familiar. Systems that reward obedience. Institutions that prioritize output over dignity. Bureaucracies that distance decision-makers from consequences. Survivors, whose numbers were now dwindling, emphasized another lesson. Silence is never neutral. They had seen how fear silenced resistance inside the camp. Later, they saw how convenience silenced memory outside it. In both cases, silence allowed harm to continue. Remembering Flossenbürg was not about preserving suffering for its own sake. It was about recognizing patterns before they repeated. This understanding reshaped the camp's place in Holocaust history. Flossenbürg was no longer viewed only through the lens of victimhood, but through responsibility. It challenged visitors to ask not only what happened here, but how would this be possible again? The answers were not comforting. They pointed toward vigilance, accountability, and the refusal to accept dehumanization in any form, especially when it arrives wrapped in legality and routine. Commemorations at Flossenbürg became quieter, more reflective. There were fewer speeches about victory, more discussions about fragility. The camp did not offer redemption. It offered clarity. It showed that systems of abuse do not require monstrous individuals at every level, only enough people willing to follow rules without questioning their purpose. In this sense, Flossenbürg's final role was not as a graveyard alone, but as a classroom, a place where history did not end with liberation, but continued as responsibility. Each preserved building, each documented testimony, each name recovered from records was part of a larger effort to resist simplification, to insist that what happened there be understood in full complexity, because complexity is where prevention begins. By the time Flossenbürg entered the 21st century as a fully recognized memorial site, its message had become clear. The camp was proof that terror does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, step by step, policy by policy, until cruelty feels normal and resistance feels unrealistic. Flossenbürg mattered because it stripped away excuses. It showed that mass suffering can be organized by people who believe they are simply doing their jobs, that morality can be outsourced, that human beings can be reduced to resources if enough people agree not to see them, and that memory, once lost, is far harder to rebuild than any camp ever was. This is why Flossenbürg cannot be forgotten. Not because it was unique, but because it was not. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Final Collapse. Flossenbürg in the last months of the war. By the beginning of 1945, the Nazi system was collapsing, but Flossenbürg was still killing. As Allied forces closed in from every direction and Germany's defeat became inevitable, the camp entered its most chaotic and deadly phase. This was not a moment of release or relief for the prisoners. It was a period defined by desperation, disorder, and intensified suffering, as the SS attempted to extract the last possible value from human lives, while also trying to erase the evidence of their crimes. Flossenbürg was never meant to be a permanent settlement. It existed to consume people, and in the final months that consumption accelerated. Transports began arriving from camps evacuated further east, Auschwitz, Grossrosen, and other collapsing sites. These prisoners arrived already starved, sick, and exhausted, flooding a camp that was barely functioning. Barracks built for hundreds now held thousands. Floors disappeared beneath layers of bodies. Sanitation collapsed completely. Lice, dysentery, and typhus spread unchecked. Food rations, already minimal, were reduced further. Soup became little more than warm water. Bread was stretched thinner and thinner. Prisoners fought over crumbs, not out of cruelty, but survival. The SS no longer pretended that labor output mattered. Many prisoners were too weak to work at all. Those who collapsed were no longer punished. They were simply ignored until they died. The camp's administrative order disintegrated. Guards rotated constantly. Discipline became erratic. Some SS men fled their posts. Others became more violent, driven by fear and rage. Executions increased not because of policy but panic. Prisoners suspected of knowing too much, resisting too quietly, or simply being inconvenient were shot or hanged without record. The quarry, once the central instrument of destruction, began to empty, not because suffering had ended, but because there were no bodies left strong enough to descend into it. Forced labor continued in armaments workshops and repair units, but productivity no longer mattered. The Reich was losing the war, yet the camp kept running, as if on momentum alone. As Allied bombing intensified across Germany, Flossenbürg shook under distant explosions. Prisoners could hear the war coming closer. Hope flickered, but so did terror. Experience had taught them that the end of the war often meant the beginning of evacuations. And evacuations meant death. Orders came down from SS headquarters. Camps were not to fall intact into enemy hands. Prisoners were to be removed, scattered, or eliminated. What followed were death marches, brutal evacuations carried out under collapsing authority. Thousands of prisoners were forced onto the roads with no food, no shelter, and no clear destination. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Bodies lined the paths through Bavaria, silent witnesses to a system that continued killing even as it died. Inside Flossenbürg, those left behind awaited their fate. The SS destroyed records, burned documents, and dismantled parts of the camp. Crematoria ran constantly, unable to keep up. Corpses were stacked in open areas, stripped of identity, stripped of ceremony. The stench of death hung over the camp, visible even to those too weak to stand. Prisoner resistance networks, which had existed quietly for years, now faced impossible choices. Some attempted to hide the sick. Others tried to preserve evidence. A few made contact with advancing Allied forces through intermediaries. Every action carried the risk of immediate execution. By April, the camp was barely recognizable as an institution. It was a graveyard still pretending to be organized. Guards no longer enforced roll calls consistently. Barracks emptied as marches departed. Silence replaced shouting. Fear replaced routine. When liberation finally came, it arrived not as a triumphant moment, but as shock. American troops encountered a place beyond military logic, a landscape of skeletal survivors, unburied dead, and infrastructure designed solely to break human beings. Many soldiers struggled to understand what they were seeing. This was not a battlefield. There were no defensive positions, no tactical explanations. Only victims. But liberation did not end the suffering immediately. Thousands were too weak to survive even rescue. Disease spread rapidly. Medical teams raced to stabilize survivors, knowing that food could kill as easily as starvation. Many died days after freedom arrived, their bodies unable to recover from years of abuse. Flossenbürg's final chapter was not written in victory or defeat. It was written in collapse. A system built on control disintegrated into chaos, revealing its true nature at last. When stripped of order, it left only death behind. This was how Flossenbürg ended, not with closure, but exposure. And the world was forced to look. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Liberation without healing. When the gates opened at Flossenbürg, liberation did not arrive at Flossenbürg as a clean ending. There were no celebrations, no cheers, no sudden return to life. When American forces reached the camp in April 1945, they did not find a place waiting to be freed. They found a place already ruined beyond recognition. A system that had collapsed inward, leaving behind human beings so damaged that freedom itself became dangerous. The SS had fled only hours or days earlier. Some guards vanished into the countryside wearing civilian clothes. Others abandoned posts without orders. A few attempted to blend into prisoner columns during evacuation marches. Their authority had evaporated, but the consequences of that authority remained everywhere. The camp was silent in a way no functioning place ever is. Not peaceful silence, but the absence of strength, the quiet of exhaustion and death. American soldiers entered expecting resistance, perhaps fortifications or weapons. Instead, they encountered bodies. Corpses lay unburied near barracks, in ditches, along paths. Survivors moved slowly, some crawling, some unable to stand, many too weak even to react to the presence of liberators. Men stared without expression. Others wept without sound. A few smiled, but their faces could not remember how. Medical teams were overwhelmed immediately. Thousands of prisoners were suffering from advanced starvation, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and untreated injuries. Many had not eaten real food in weeks. Their bodies had adapted to near-zero intake. Giving them food too quickly could kill them, a phenomenon doctors would later understand as refeeding syndrome. Every decision carried risk. Saving lives required restraint, patience, and time. Luxuries the survivors no longer had. Makeshift hospitals were established inside and around the camp. Barracks became wards. Soldiers and doctors improvised treatments with limited supplies. Survivors were washed, deloused, and clothed, but many were beyond recovery. Liberation for them came too late. They died in clean beds under medical care, days or weeks after the gates opened, free, but unable to live. The psychological damage was equally profound. Years of terror had erased trust, identity, and hope. Some prisoners feared leaving the camp, convinced that freedom was another deception. Others wandered aimlessly, unsure where to go or whether anyone was waiting. Entire families had been destroyed. Homes no longer existed. Countries had changed borders. For many, survival meant nothing more than continuing to breathe. American forces quickly realized that Flossenbürg was not an anomaly. It was part of a system. Investigators began documenting what they found, photographing bodies, recording testimonies, preserving documents that the SS had failed to destroy. Survivors were interviewed carefully, their words treated as evidence rather than memory. The camp became a crime scene. The sheer scale of suffering challenged comprehension. Flossenbürg had not relied on gas chambers as its primary method of killing. Its weapon had been labor, hunger, and neglect, slow, deniable, bureaucratic death. This made its crimes harder to explain and easier to excuse. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Thousands of dead. Thousands more permanently damaged. A place built to erase people quietly. As the days passed, burial details began the grim task of honoring the dead. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were counted where possible, though many identities were already lost. Numbers replaced names. This, too, was a continuation of the camp's logic. Even in death, individuality was difficult to restore. Survivors were eventually transferred to displaced persons camps, hospitals, or repatriation centers. Some returned home to find nothing left. Others chose never to return, building new lives elsewhere. Many carried silence with them, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had endured. Trauma did not end with liberation. It merely changed form. Meanwhile, attention turned to accountability. Flossenbürg's guards, administrators, doctors, and overseers were hunted, arrested, and interrogated. Some were caught quickly. Others escaped justice entirely. Trials would follow, but justice would always be incomplete. No sentence could restore the dead or undo the years stolen. Liberation exposed the truth, but it did not heal it. Flossenbürg stood revealed not as a failure of the Nazi system, but one of its successes. It had done exactly what it was designed to do: extract labor, destroy bodies, erase identities, and leave behind survivors so damaged that survival itself felt like punishment. The gates opened, the world entered, and what it found could never be unseen. This was not the end of suffering at Flossenbürg. It was the beginning of memory. Chapter 10, Segment 3. After the camp, justice, memory, and the shadow that remained. When Flossenbürg finally emptied, it did not disappear. The barbed wire still stood. The quarry still scarred the hillside. The barracks still carried the smell of sickness and death long after the last survivor was taken away. What remained was not just a place, but a question: what would the world do with what it had found here? In the months after liberation, investigators returned again and again. They walked the camp with notebooks and cameras, measuring distances, counting graves, tracing chains of command. Survivors were asked to speak, often repeatedly, recounting events they had spent years trying to forget. Their testimonies became the backbone of prosecutions, the fragile bridge between memory and law. Each statement carried weight not only for what it proved, but for what it preserved. Without them, Flossenbürg would have risked becoming just another ruined site, its crimes absorbed into statistics. Trials followed. Guards, doctors, administrators, and capos were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Some showed remorse. Many denied responsibility, claiming obedience to orders or ignorance of outcomes. The language of bureaucracy returned, roles, procedures, necessity now repurposed as defense. Sentences were handed down, executions carried out, prison terms imposed. Yet even as verdicts were read, it was clear that justice would be partial. Too many perpetrators had vanished into the chaos of defeat. Too many victims had no one left to speak their names. For survivors, justice offered little comfort. The trials were distant, abstract, conducted in languages they did not speak, in courtrooms far from the places where their lives had been destroyed. What they faced instead was the long work of living, of rebuilding bodies weakened by starvation, minds fractured by fear, identities reduced to numbers. Some found family members who had survived elsewhere. Many did not. Some returned to hometowns that no longer wanted them or that no longer existed. Others chose exile, believing that the soil itself could never again feel safe. Silence became a survival strategy. In the years after the war, many survivors rarely spoke of Flossenbürg. The world wanted to move on. Nations rebuilt. Economies recovered. New conflicts drew attention elsewhere. The camps were acknowledged, but often at a distance, softened by generalities. Forced labor camps like Flossenbürg, without the immediate symbolism of gas chambers, were especially vulnerable to being misunderstood or forgotten. Yet memory persisted quietly. Former prisoners returned to the site, sometimes alone, sometimes together. They marked locations where barracks had stood, where executions had taken place, where friends had collapsed under stones too heavy to carry. They told stories not for drama, but for accuracy. Slowly, memorials were erected, museums established, archives opened. The camp was preserved not as a relic of the past, but as a warning embedded in the landscape. Flossenbürg's history complicated the narrative of the Holocaust. It showed that mass death did not require sealed chambers or industrial gas. It could be achieved through work schedules, calorie reductions, medical neglect, and administrative distance. It revealed how a modern state could convert economic need into a killing mechanism, and how cruelty could hide behind productivity reports and efficiency goals. This understanding reshaped how historians spoke about genocide. It shifted focus from moments of killing to systems of control, from ideology alone to infrastructure, from fanatic leaders to ordinary participants who made choices, small ones, daily ones, that kept the system running. Flossenbürg became evidence not only of Nazi crimes, but of the dangers inherent in any society that allows people to be reduced to functions. As decades passed, new generations encountered the camp through education rather than survival. Students walked the grounds where prisoners once marched. They read letters written in pencil on scraps of paper, smuggled out and never answered. They learned names that had been erased from records and restored through research. The camp became a classroom, not to teach despair, but responsibility. And still the shadow remained. Denial surfaced. Distortion followed. Numbers were questioned. Motives reinterpreted. The familiar pattern returned, the same logic that had once minimized suffering now attempting to rewrite it. Flossenbürg's preservation stood against that impulse, insisting on evidence, testimony, and truth. Today, the camp exists as both a memorial and a mirror. It reflects what happens when labor becomes a weapon, when obedience replaces conscience, and when suffering is normalized through routine. It asks uncomfortable questions not only about the past, but about the present. About how systems treat the expendable. About how quickly language can strip away humanity. About how silence can become complicity. Flossenbürg did not end in 1945. It continues in memory, in archives, in the lives shaped by its legacy. Its history reminds us that genocide is not only an act of destruction, but a process, one that can be built, managed, and justified unless it is recognized and resisted. The camp is empty now, but its warning is not. As night falls over the hills of Bavaria, Flossenbürg grows quiet again. The quarry is still. The barracks no longer echo with shouted orders. The paths once worn by starving men are now empty. And yet, the camp is not silent. What happened here was not chaos. It was design. Suffering was organized, scheduled, and justified. Human beings were reduced to labor units, measured by output and discarded when they failed. Flossenbürg shows us that genocide does not always arrive with sudden violence. Sometimes it comes slowly through routine, obedience, and the belief that some lives matter less than others. For those who survived, memory became a responsibility. For those who did not, memory is all that remains. Their names, their stories, their unfinished lives live on only if they are remembered. This documentary was not made to shock, but to understand. Because places like Flossenbürg are not just remnants of the past. They are warnings. They remind us how easily cruelty can be normalized, how systems can turn against humanity, and how silence allows it to continue. If you are listening tonight, let this be a moment of reflection. Not just on what happened, but on what must never happen again. Thank you for bearing witness, and may the victims of Flossenbürg never be forgotten.